Hey guys, tonight we're tracing the winding, often thorny routes of Mother's Day, stepping away from modern branch lines and commercial card aisles to wander back into smoke-choked mountain shrines and ancient stone sanctuaries. You're settling into your favorite corner, maybe pulling a weighted blanket closer. While I promise you probably won't survive this history lesson without at least one unexpected yawn, a sudden craving for quiet, or a deep appreciation for the very idea of motherhood itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Take a slow breath, drop your current location and local time in the comments so we can share this quiet evening across the map, and settle in. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through ancient Anatolian dust as the first rays of dawn bleed over the rocky spine of Mount Ida. The air is thick, heavy with a resinous haze that catches in your throat and clings to your clothes. This is the Phrygian smoke, the aromatic breath of a landscape that has been breathing devotion for millennia. Beneath your sandals, the ground feels baked and unforgiving, yet you keep moving toward the low, rhythmic thrum that seems to vibrate up through your very souls. You are walking toward the sanctuary of Cybele, the primordial mother of gods, whose presence here feels less like a polite invitation and more like a gravitational pull. The ancients didn't just visit these shrines, they surrendered to them. And as you draw closer, you realize the incense burning in bronze braziers isn't meant to be pleasant. It's frankincense, myrrh, and pine resin, layered so thick it's designed to overwhelm, to blur the line between the mundane and the divine. It's the ancient world's version of an essential oil diffuser left on high for 3 days straight. Though honestly, the locals would probably argue it's the only way to properly greet a deity who supposedly gave birth to mountains. The drums begin before you even see the temple courtyard. They don't just play a rhythm, they dictate your heartbeat. You feel the pulse in your ribs, a steady, earth-shaking beat that echoes off the limestone cliffs. This isn't background music for a casual gathering. It's a sonic architecture carefully engineered to induce trance. The priests, known as the Galli, move through the haze in dyed robes and gold diadems, their hands working tambourines and castanets with practiced precision. They've traded conventional social roles for a life dedicated entirely to the Great Mother. And watching them now, you catch yourself wondering how they manage to keep time while looking like they're auditioning for a very theatrical Renaissance fair. You probably wouldn't survive a weekend of that lifestyle without a serious nap schedule and a few ibuprofen. Yet here, in the swirling dust, the music feels less like performance and more like prayer made audible. Every strike of the frame drum sends another ripple through the incense smoke, twisting it into spirals that catch the morning light. You step aside as a procession of devotees winds past, carrying pine cones and sheaves of barley, their eyes fixed on something you can't quite see but can deeply feel. Cybele herself is rarely depicted in soft maternal terms. Instead, she's carved from black meteoric stone or molded into towering terracotta statues, crowned with a city wall flanked by lions, her posture regal and unyielding. She is the earth, yes, but the earth in its most untamed, fertile, and occasionally terrifying aspect. The mainstream historical record confirms that her worship originated in the Phrygian highlands long before Greek or Roman empires tried to claim her as their own. She was Magna Mater, the Great Mother, the sovereign of wild places, and the keeper of thresholds. But there's a quirk hidden in the margins of the old text that always makes modern researchers pause. Some accounts suggest the sacred drums used in her rites were actually modified winnowing fans, agricultural tools hollowed out and stretched with ox hide to catch the mountain wind. It's a quiet, practical magic, turning the very instruments of harvest into vessels of worship. You run your fingers over a weathered stone altar as you imagine it, feeling the grooves worn smooth centuries by centuries of palms, oils, and off. The boundary between farming and faith blurs here as it should. You don't separate the soil that feeds you from the hands that tilled it. Historians still argue whether the ecstatic frenzy of these early festivals was a purely organic, grassroots spiritual expression or a carefully curated mechanism of political control designed to unify scattered tribal communities under a single awe-inspiring banner. You sit on a low stone ledge, letting the debate wash over you like the morning mist. Maybe it doesn't need a tidy answer. Maybe the truth lives in the space between, in the way a community can share a single rhythm and suddenly feel less alone in the world. The smoke curls upward, carrying whispers of petitions, thanks and quiet hopes for fertility, safe childbirth and bountiful harvests. You notice a small clay figurine left at the base of an olive tree nearby, its features softened by rain and time. It's a mother holding a child, or perhaps just a woman holding her own center together. The gesture is so familiar it makes your chest ache, even after 2,000 years. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the vibrating drums synchronize with your breathing. The cadence slows, just slightly, as the procession begins to settle into a series of low chants. The air grows warmer, heavy with the scent of crushed herbs and sun-baked earth. You think about how strange it is that the concept of honoring motherhood has survived empires rising and falling, languages shifting, calendars changing, only to arrive in your modern inbox as a digital coupon for 20% off spa packages. Yet beneath that commercial veneer, the core impulse remains startlingly intact. You still want to pause. You still want to acknowledge the unseen labor, the quiet endurance, the people who kept you fed, safe, and tethered to the world when everything else felt unmoored. The Phrygian priests knew this instinct. They didn't build quiet sitting rooms or hand out greeting cards. They built amphitheaters of sound and scent, spaces where gratitude could be felt in the bones rather than just nodded at in passing. You watch a young woman step forward to place a woven crown of ivy on a stone pedestal. Her movements are slow, deliberate, reverent. She doesn't speak, but the gesture carries the weight of 100 silent thank yous. You feel it land somewhere deep in your own posture, a gentle reminder that honor doesn't always need words. Sometimes it just needs presence. The drums finally fade to a murmur. The smoke begins to thin, revealing patches of pale blue sky between the mountain ridges. You brush a fine layer of dust from your knees and stand, feeling the slow stretch of muscles that have been carrying you through time. The sanctuary grows quiet, save for the wind moving through the pine branches and the distant clatter of livestock on a lower trail. You take a slow walk around the outer courtyard, reading the worn carvings on the boundary stones, each one a faded map of devotion. You notice how the path naturally curves inward, as if the landscape itself is guiding footsteps toward a center. It's a subtle design, but it works. You're already thinking about how to carry this quiet reverence forward, how to let the stillness settle into your evening routine without trying to force it into something loud or grand. The ancient Phrygians didn't rush their mother goddess, and you don't need to rush this either. You simply let the mountain air cool your skin, listen to the fading echo of the last drumbeat, and prepare for the next step down the trail. You step from the mountain path onto the cobblestones of Rome, and the air changes instantly. The crisp pine scent of Anatolia gives way to something heavier, sweeter, laced with roasted garlic, wine spills, and the faint metallic tang of crowd sweat under a spring sun. The Hilaria has arrived, and the city doesn't just celebrate, it unravels. You feel it in the way the usual social hierarchies seem to soften at the edges, like wax left too long near a flame. Slaves laugh a little louder with their masters. Children dart between legs of togas without a scolding, and for one wild waited week, the rules feel optional. Above it all, the gaze of Rhea, the Roman face of Cybele, watches from temple frescoes and marble busts, her expression unreadable but undeniably present. You catch yourself straightening your posture under that stone-eyed attention, even though you know, logically, it's just art. But art has gravity here, especially when it's tied to a goddess who supposedly taught mountains how to sit still. The parade begins near the Circus Maximus, and you're swept into the current of bodies moving like a single, breathing organism. Cymbals crash overhead, not in the steady, trance-like rhythm of the Phrygian drums you remember, but in sharp, joyful bursts that seem to bounce off the aqueducts and ripple through the forum. Masked revelers swirl past you, their faces hidden behind carved wood and painted linen, some grinning with exaggerated joy, others wearing solemn, almost theatrical grief. It's a carnival of contradictions, and you're not sure whether to clap, bow, or just try not to get elbowed in the ribs by someone enthusiastically reenacting a myth you only half remember. You probably wouldn't survive a Roman street party without tripping over your own sandals, or accidentally quoting the wrong poet at the wrong time. Yet here, in the beautiful chaos, mistakes feel forgiven. The Hilaria, after all, is the festival of laughter, of release, of letting the heavy burdens of daily life dissolve into the spring air like mist. Mainstream history confirms that the Romans formally adopted Cybele's worship around 204 BCE during the Second Punic War, when the Sibylline books advised bringing the Magna Mater to Rome to help defeat Hannibal. They built her a temple on the Palatine Hill and wove her into the state religion, but they couldn't quite tame her wild edges. Instead, they gave those edges a parade route. You watch as a float shaped like a lion-drawn chariot rolls by, pulled by actors in elaborate costumes who occasionally toss handfuls of flower petals into the crowd. The petals stick to sweaty brows and woolen tunics, turning the procession into a moving mosaic of colour and scent. It's lavish, yes, but there's a method to the madness. Every element, the masks, the music, the temporary suspension of norms, serves a purpose: to remind the city that renewal requires release, that order sometimes needs a little chaos to stay vibrant. You find a quiet spot against a sun-warmed wall to observe, letting the spectacle wash over you without feeling pressured to join in. Sometimes the best way to honour a moment is just to witness it. There's a quirky tidbit tucked away in old festival accounts that always makes modern researchers smile. Some participants carried small hollow figurines that, when shaken, produced a soft rattling sound, meant to mimic the laughter of the gods. Imagine walking through a parade, trying to look dignified while your little clay companion goes shaka shaka with every step. It's the ancient equivalent of wearing a novelty hat to a formal event, and you have to admire the commitment. You spot a group of young people near the Temple of Magna Mater doing exactly that. Their faces serious but their eyes sparkling with mischief. One of them catches your glance and gives a tiny conspiratorial shake of their figurine. You chuckle, and the sound gets lost in the cymbal crash, but the connection feels real. It's a small reminder that humour has always been a bridge between the sacred and the everyday, a way to keep devotion from turning too stiff or solemn. Historians still argue whether the role reversal and masked anonymity of the Hilaria were primarily spiritual tools for empathy, letting the powerful feel what it's like to be powerless, if only for a day, or simply a sanctioned pressure valve to prevent social unrest from boiling over. You lean against the wall, watching a merchant in a fine wool tunic playfully beg for coins from a slave dressed in mock regalia, and you wonder if the answer matters. Maybe the magic is in the ambiguity itself, in the space where a society can safely explore its own contradictions without collapsing. The parade swells around you, a river of sound and motion, and you feel the weighted gaze of Rhea again, not as judgment, but as invitation. To participate, to reflect, to simply be present in the beautiful messy act of communal celebration. You take a slow breath, letting the cymbal vibrations settle in your chest, and notice how the afternoon light is beginning to soften, gilding the edges of the crowd in gold. As the procession winds toward the Tiber, the energy shifts subtly. The boisterous laughter mellows into contented hums, the sharp crashes of cymbals give way to softer tambourine rhythms, and people begin to pair off or gather in small circles to share bread and diluted wine. You join a group sitting on the grassy bank, accepting a piece of honeyed cake from a stranger who offers it with a nod. The taste is simple but profound. Flower, honey, a hint of citrus, and you realize how much of this festival is really about nourishment in its broadest sense, feeding the body, the spirit, the community. You glance at the river, where small boats decorated with flowers drift lazily downstream, carrying offerings of fruit and flowers to be released into the current. It's a gentle counterpoint to the earlier frenzy, a reminder that after the release comes the return, after the chaos comes the calm. You feel your own shoulders drop, the tension of the day melting into the warm Roman evening. You think about how the Hilaria's spirit of temporary liberations echoes in modern celebrations. Even if we've swapped masks for memes and chariots for car parades, the core impulse remains: to create a space where the usual rules can bend, where joy can be loud and unapologetic, where gratitude for life's nurturing forces can be expressed not just in words but in shared experience. You watch a child chase a floating flower petal along the riverbank, their laughter ringing clear above the gentle lapping of water. It's a small moment, but it feels connected to everything that came before. The Phrygian drums, the mountain smoke, the weighted gaze of a goddess who understands both wildness and tenderness. You finish your cake, brush the crumbs from your hands and stand, feeling ready for the next step in this long, winding journey. The sun dips lower, painting the sky in shades of apricot and lavender, and you take one last look at the river before turning back toward the city streets, where lanterns are beginning to flicker to life. You leave the warm Roman evening behind and step into the crisp, damp air of a 16th century English lane. The cobblestones here are uneven, slick with morning dew and the occasional patch of mud that threatens to claim your boot if you're not careful. The sky is a soft, pearly grey, the kind that makes everything feel slightly hushed, as if the world itself is holding its breath in reverence. You're walking on the fourth Sunday of Lent, and the path ahead is dotted with figures in simple woolen cloaks, their heads bowed not in sorrow but in quiet purpose. These are servants, apprentices, and young workers, all trudging home for the day known as Mothering Sunday. You feel the weight of their journey in your own steps, a stiffness in the knees from miles walked, a pleasant ache in the shoulders from carrying not just bundles, but expectations. It's a long way to go just for a single meal and a moment of prayer. But then again, when was the last time you walked 10 miles for something that truly mattered? You probably wouldn't survive this pilgrimage without at least 3 snack breaks and a very persuasive podcast. The lanes are stiff with tradition, every twist and turn familiar to those who've walked them since childhood. You pass hedgerows heavy with early spring buds, and the air carries the faint green scent of crushed nettles and damp earth. In your hands you clutch a small posy of wildflowers, primroses, violets, and a sprig of lavender, tied with a scrap of linen. It's not much to look at, but it feels weighted with meaning. These flowers aren't just decoration, they're a language, a silent offering of gratitude and remembrance. You remember the flower petals tossed in Roman parades, but here the gesture is quieter, more intimate. Each bloom is chosen with care, its colour and scent carrying a message words might fumble. A violet for faithfulness, a primrose for young love, lavender for devotion. You tuck the posy a little closer to your chest, feeling the delicate stems press against your palm, and wonder how many hands have held similar bundles along this very path. Mainstream historical records confirm that Mothering Sunday began as a time when domestic servants were given a rare day off to visit their mother church, the cathedral or parish where they were baptized, and often, by extension, their actual mothers. It was a practical mercy wrapped in spiritual significance, a brief return to roots in a world that rarely allowed for pauses. As you approach the village, the sound of church bells begins to ripple through the air, not the sharp, celebratory clang of festival days, but a softer, more contemplative toll that seems to wrap around the landscape like a shawl. You follow the crowd toward the stone church, its walls weathered to a gentle grey, its windows glowing with the muted light of stained glass. Inside, the air is cool and still, scented with old wood, beeswax candles, and the faint lingering trace of incense from earlier services. You find a spot near the back, kneeling on the worn stone floor that has been smoothed by centuries of devoted knees. The act of kneeling feels different here. Not performative, not rushed, but a slow, deliberate settling into reverence. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the quiet hum of whispered prayers and the soft rustle of woolen garments fill your senses. It's a stark contrast to the ecstatic drums of Cybele or the carnival chaos of the Hilaria, but it carries its own kind of vibration, a low, steady frequency of communal hope. You probably wouldn't survive a 3-hour sermon in a drafty medieval church without at least one discreet yawn or a silent debate about the architectural merits of flying buttresses. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in old parish records that always makes modern researchers pause. Some communities practiced clipping the church, a ritual where congregants would join hands and form a human chain around the church building, literally embracing the structure as a symbol of unity and protection. Imagine trying to coordinate that without tripping over your own feet or accidentally elbowing your neighbour in the ribs. It's the medieval equivalent of a group hug, and you have to admire the logistical optimism. You glance around the nave, picturing the scene, rows of people in homespun wool, their breath visible in the chilly air, all connected by a shared gesture of affection for the place that anchored their spiritual lives. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of devotion are also the most physically awkward, and that's perfectly okay. Historians still argue whether Mothering Sunday was primarily about honouring the institutional church as mother, or if it genuinely evolved to include veneration of human mothers from the start. You sit back on your heels, watching a young woman near the altar gently place her posy on a stone ledge, her movements tender and unhurried. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the overlap, the way a community can hold both meanings at once, letting them enrich each other like layers of colour in a stained glass window. The service moves into a hymn, and the voices rise, not in perfect harmony but in something more honest, more human. You join in softly, your voice blending with the others, and feel a strange sense of belonging, even though you're centuries away from your own time. The lyrics speak of mercy, of return, of grace found in unexpected places, and you let the words wash over you without overanalyzing. Sometimes a song is just a song, and sometimes it's a bridge across time. After the service, the congregation spills back into the lane, the mood lighter now, tinged with the quiet joy of reunion. You spot families gathering in small clusters, embracing, sharing news, passing around small treats wrapped in cloth. A woman offers you a slice of simnel cake, its marzipan layer firm but sweet, and you accept with a grateful nod. The taste is rich and spiced, a little dense, perfect for sustaining a long walk home. You remember the honeyed cake by the Tiber, but this feels different, more grounded, more domestic. It's food as comfort, as connection, as a tangible expression of care. You watch a child present her mother with a tiny posy, the flowers already slightly wilted from the journey but no less cherished. The mother's smile is soft, her eyes a little shiny, and you feel that familiar ache in your chest, the one that recognizes love in its simplest, most enduring forms. You probably wouldn't survive a day of medieval childcare without at least one minor panic about teething remedies or the proper way to swaddle a baby in wool. As the afternoon light begins to soften, you start the walk back, the posy now tucked safely in your pocket, its scent a gentle reminder of the day. The lane feels different on the return journey, less stiff, more forgiving, as if the act of honouring has loosened something in the landscape itself. You pass a field where early lambs gambol under the watchful eyes of their mothers, and you can't help but smile at the obviousness of it all. Nature doesn't need a designated day to celebrate motherhood. It does it constantly, quietly, in every nest, every den, every quiet nudge toward independence. Yet humans, with our calendars and our rituals, seem to need the reminder. We need the pause, the intentional gesture, the chance to say thank you out loud. You think about how this simple English tradition, servants walking home with wildflowers, would eventually ripple across oceans and centuries, evolving into something global, commercial, complicated. But for now, in this moment, it's just a walk, a prayer, a posy, and the quiet certainty that some bonds are worth the miles. You adjust your cloak against the evening chill, feeling the weight of the day settle into a comfortable warmth, and prepare for the next turn in the path where the story continues to unfold. You leave the quiet English lane behind and feel the ground shift beneath your feet, the soft moss and dewy grass giving way to something harder, grittier. The air changes too, no longer carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and beeswax, but thick with coal dust, wood smoke, and the faint, metallic tang of iron ore processing. You're trudging through the soot-stained valleys of West Virginia now, where the mountains rise like silent sentinels over narrow hollows and wooden cabins cling to hillsides as if afraid to slip. The year is the mid-1800s, and the world here feels heavy, weighted with the struggle of daily survival. You pull your shawl a little tighter, not just against the chill, but against the weight of what you're about to witness. You probably wouldn't survive a week in this landscape without at least one dramatic coughing fit, a stubborn blister, and a deep appreciation for indoor plumbing. Yet here, in the heart of industrializing America, a different kind of motherhood is taking root, one that doesn't just nurture children, but fights for the very conditions that let them live. You follow a narrow path down into the hollow, where the sound of rushing water mixes with the distant clank of machinery and the occasional shout of a worker. The houses are small, their windows smudged with grime, their yards cluttered with tools, laundry lines, and the cheerful chaos of family life. But beneath the surface, there's a quiet tension. Cholera has swept through these valleys before, leaving empty cradles and hushed prayers in its wake. Typhoid lingers in the wells. Dysentery waits in the unwashed hands of children playing in the dirt. You feel the toxic spread of disease not as a distant concept, but as a presence in the air, a shadow in the corner of every room. And yet, in the midst of this, you see a woman moving with purpose. Anna Jarvis doesn't walk. She strides. Her dress is practical, her apron clean, her eyes sharp with a determination that feels almost vibrating in its intensity. She's not waiting for permission to make change. She's organizing, educating, mobilizing. You watch as she knocks on a cabin door, greets a young mother with a warm but firm smile, and begins to explain, in clear, unhurried words, how boiling water can save a life. Mainstream historical records confirm that Anna Jarvis founded Mother's Day work clubs in the 1850s and 1860s, first in Grafton, West Virginia, and later spreading to other Appalachian communities. These weren't social teas or gentle sewing circles. They were grassroots public health initiatives, where mothers gathered to share knowledge about sanitation, nursing, and disease prevention. They pooled resources to buy medicine, distributed clean linens to sick families, and even lobbied local authorities for better water sources. It was community care, organized and relentless. You sit on a rough-hewn bench outside a club meeting, listening as Anne demonstrates how to properly ventilate a sick room, her voice steady over the crackle of the fireplace. She doesn't preach, she empowers. She doesn't scold, she equips. And you realize that this, too, is a form of motherhood, extending the instinct to protect beyond one's own children to an entire community. You probably wouldn't survive a day of 19th century public health campaigning without at least one dramatic fainting spell and a strong cup of coffee. But Anne makes it look like just another Tuesday. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in local oral histories that always makes modern researchers pause. Some accounts suggest the work clubs used a secret code of quilt patterns to signal meeting locations or health warnings, like a domestic underground railroad of care. A bear's paw pattern might mean bring extra blankets, while a drunkard's path could warn of a contaminated well. Imagine trying to coordinate disease prevention with neighbors who haven't bathed in a week and a mule that keeps stealing the meeting minutes. It's the 19th century equivalent of a group chat with spotty signal, and you have to admire the creativity. You glance at a quilt hanging on a nearby line, its geometric patterns bold and colourful, and wonder how many stories are stitched into its threads. It's a reminder that sometimes the most vital knowledge is passed not in lectures, but in the quiet language of everyday objects. Historians still argue whether Anna Jarvis's early work clubs were primarily public health initiatives or subtle acts of social reform that challenged gender norms of the era. You lean against the cabin wall, watching as a group of women practice bandaging techniques on each other's arms, their laughter soft but genuine. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the impact. The way these clubs created spaces where women's knowledge was valued, where their labour was recognised as essential, where their voices could shape the health of their communities. The meeting winds down, and Anne hands out small packets of dried herbs for wounds, mint for digestion, chamomile for calm. You accept one, feeling the delicate leaves crumble slightly in your palm, and notice how the women's postures have shifted. They stand a little taller, speak a little more confidently, carry the weight of their roles not as burdens, but as tools. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes courage when it's quiet, persistent, and utterly necessary. As the afternoon light begins to soften, casting long shadows across the hollow, you walk with Anne toward the edge of the settlement. She points out a new well the club helped fund, its stone lining clean and sturdy, its rope fresh and strong. Clean water, she says simply, is the first prayer. You nod, understanding that for her, faith isn't just about Sunday services, it's about Monday mornings, about the practical heavy work of keeping people alive. You think about the Phrygian drums, the Roman parades, the English posies, all different expressions of honouring the nurturing force in life. But here, in this soot-stained valley, honour looks like scrubbing floors, boiling linens, and teaching neighbours how to spot the early signs of fever. It's less poetic, maybe, but no less profound. You probably wouldn't survive a winter in Appalachia without at least one close call with frostbite and a very persuasive argument for wool socks. The path ahead winds toward a small, neutral house on the edge of town, where lanterns are beginning to flicker to life. You can hear the soft murmur of voices, the clink of teacups, the gentle rustle of skirts. Anne pauses for a moment, her expression softening just slightly. "Tomorrow," she says, "we meet with mothers from the other side." You know what she means. The Civil War has torn communities apart, pitting neighbour against neighbour, brother against brother. But in this hollow, in this moment, there's a different possibility. You feel the heavy determination that brought you here begin to shift. Not into hope exactly, but into something quieter, more fragile, the willingness to try. You adjust your shawl, take a slow breath of the coal-scented air, and prepare to step into the next part of the story, where grief and grace might just find a way to share a table. You step onto the porch of the neutral house, and the air feels different, less charged with the grit of labour, more suspended with the quiet tension of possibility. The wooden planks creak softly under your weight, a gentle reminder that even neutrality has its own kind of weight. Inside, the room is warm, lit by the soft glow of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls adorned with simple quilts and framed photographs of faces both smiling and solemn. The scent of bergamot and chamomile drifts through the air, mingling with the faint aroma of yeast rolls fresh from the oven. You find a seat at the long, scarred table, its surface worn smooth by generations of hands, and watch as women in grey and blue, Union and Confederate mothers, settle into chairs with the careful deliberation of people who have spent years learning how to move without drawing fire. Their grief is stiff. You can feel it in the way they hold their teacups, in the slight hesitation before they meet each other's eyes. But beneath that stiffness, something else is stirring, something vibrating with a quiet, persistent hope. You probably wouldn't survive an afternoon of post-war reconciliation tea without at least one awkward silence, a misplaced comment about the weather, and a desperate craving for a cookie to fill the conversational gaps. Anna Jarvis moves through the room with the same practical grace you witnessed in the hollow, but today her purpose is subtler. She doesn't lecture or organise, she facilitates. She pours tea with steady hands, offers a roll with a gentle nod, and creates spaces where conversation can happen without pressure. You watch as a woman in a faded blue dress hesitates before accepting a cup from a woman in homespun grey. Their fingers brush for just a moment, and you see the slightest softening around their eyes. Not forgiveness yet, not forgetfulness, but the first fragile acknowledgement of shared humanity. Mainstream historical records confirm that in 1868, Anna Jarvis organised a Mothers' Friendship Day in Pruntytown, West Virginia, bringing together mothers from both sides of the Civil War to promote reconciliation and community healing. It wasn't a grand political summit or a formal treaty signing. It was tea, it was talk, it was the radical act of sitting down with someone you've been taught to see as an enemy, and remembering that you both know the weight of a child's fever, the ache of an empty chair at the table, the quiet prayer for a loved one's safe return. You sip your tea, feeling the warmth spread through your chest, and realize that sometimes the most revolutionary acts are also the most ordinary. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in local family letters that always makes modern researchers smile. Some accounts suggest the women used a specific seating arrangement to ease tensions, placing mothers who had lost sons on opposite sides directly across from each other, with a shared bowl of honeyed apples between them as a neutral offering. Imagine trying to navigate that delicate diplomacy, whilst also making sure the teapot doesn't run dry, and the children don't knock over the biscuit plate. It's the 19th century equivalent of a carefully moderated online forum, and you have to admire the emotional logistics. You glance at the table, noticing how the placement of chairs creates small circles of conversation, how the shared dishes encourage passing and offering, how the simple act of breaking bread together becomes a bridge. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound peace-building happens not in grand halls, but in kitchens, over cups of tea and plates of slightly burnt cookies. Historians still argue whether these early mothers' friendship gatherings were genuinely transformative in healing post-war divisions, or if they served more as to perform reconciliation without urgent, deeply structural injustices. With a stressing as you lean back in your chair, watching as a young mother in grey tentatively asks the woman across from her about her daughter's recovery from measles. The conversation starts haltingly, but gradually, the stiffness begins to melt. Voices soften, gestures become more relaxed, and laughter, tentative at first then more genuine, ripples through the room. Maybe the answer isn't either or. Maybe the magic is in the overlap. The way symbolic acts can create the emotional space for real change to take root. Like seeds planted in soil that's been gently loosened. You feel that vibration in your chest again, the one that recognizes hope when it's quiet, persistent, and utterly necessary. You probably wouldn't survive a day of 19th century diplomatic tea without at least one spilled cup, a poorly timed joke, and a deep appreciation for the universal language of baked goods. As the afternoon light begins to soften, casting long golden rays through the windows, the atmosphere in the room shifts. The conversation flows more easily now, touching on shared concerns, children's health, harvest yields, the challenge of mending clothes with limited supplies. A woman in blue offers a tip for soothing teething pain. A woman in grey shares a recipe for preserving apples through the winter. The exchange isn't just practical, it's intimate. It's the recognition that motherhood, in its daily, gritty reality, transcends political boundaries. You watch as two women, one with a small Union pin still visible on her collar, the other with a Confederate ribbon tucked into her apron, lean in to examine a quilt pattern together, their heads to close, their fingers tracing the stitches. The gesture is so simple, so ordinary, and yet it feels like a quiet miracle. You remember the Phrygian drums that vibrated through mountain stone, the Roman cymbals that echoed off aqueducts, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the West Virginia work clubs that fought disease with heavy determination. All of it has led to this moment, to a room where grief is softening into connection, where the weighted silence of loss is beginning to hum with the vibrating possibility of renewal. The tea service winds down, and the women begin to gather their shawls and baskets. But the mood isn't one of departure. It's one of continuation. Promises are made to meet again, to share seeds, to check on each other's families. Anne stands near the door, offering a quiet word to each woman as she leaves, her expression a blend of exhaustion and satisfaction. You step out onto the porch with the last group, watching as the women walk away in pairs and small clusters, their conversations carrying softly on the evening air. The sky is painted in shades of lavender and rose, and the first stars are beginning to prick through the twilight. You feel the heavy determination that brought you here settle into something lighter, more resilient. Not a resolution to all the world's problems, but a commitment to keep showing up, keep listening, keep offering tea. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional labor of post-war reconciliation without at least one good cry in the barn and a very long nap, but these women are made of sterner stuff. You take a slow walk around the side of the house, where a small garden is just beginning to stir with early spring blooms. A cluster of violets catches your eye, their delicate purple petals glowing in the fading light. You think about the English posies carried home on Mothering Sunday, the Roman flower petals tossed in parades, the wild herbs distributed by the work clubs. Flowers have always been a language for what words can't quite hold: gratitude, remembrance, hope. You pluck a single violet, its stem cool and supple in your fingers, and tuck it into your pocket as a quiet token of the day. As you turn to leave, you glance back at the house, its windows now glowing warmly against the deepening blue of evening. Inside, the table is being cleared, the teacups washed, the quilts folded. But the spirit of the gathering lingers, vibrating in the air like the last note of a song. You feel ready for whatever comes next, carrying with you the weighted truth that reconciliation isn't a single event, but a practice, a daily choice to see the human behind the label, to offer tea before judgment, to let stiff grief soften into vibrating hope. You adjust your shawl against the evening chill, take one last breath of the flower-scented air, and prepare to step into the next chapter of this long, winding story. You leave the quiet resonance of that shared tea table behind and step into a different kind of stillness. The air here is thick, not with coal dust or spring blossoms, but with the heavy silence of a house holding its breath. It's early May of 1905, and the Philadelphia row house feels wrapped in layers of muted velvet and shadow. You move carefully across the floorboards, avoiding the familiar creaks near the stairs, as if loud footsteps might disturb the dust settling on furniture that suddenly feels too large, too hollow. This is the vigil. Anna Jarvis sits by a rain-streaked window, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The heavy stillness isn't just emotional, it's woven into the very architecture of the room. Black crepe drapes swallow the afternoon light. White linen covers hide the mirrors to spare the reflection from what they might show, and the mantel sits stripped of bright ornaments, leaving only space for a single photograph in a dark frame. You probably wouldn't survive a week of 1905 morning customs without accidentally laughing at a poorly timed joke, tripping over a trailing veil, and desperately needing someone to explain why the dining cutlery suddenly has to be wrapped in black tissue paper. Yet here, in this heavy quiet, grief has nowhere to hide, and it's taking its time. You settle into a high-backed parlour chair near the cold hearth, where a few damp logs wait in a brass basket. The silence isn't empty, it's full of echoes. You can almost feel the residual warmth of a hand that's just let go, the careful weight of a final instruction, the quiet rasp of a life that spent decades organising, healing and fighting for the welfare of others. Anne Reeves Jarvis passed away on May 9, 1905, and the house hasn't quite figured out how to exhale yet. But her voice lingers in the heavy atmosphere, crystallized in a single haunting wish spoken just days before the end. I hope someone will found a memorial Mother's Day. Anna doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. The words have already taken stiff root in her soul, anchoring themselves deep beneath the surface of her shock, her sorrow, her sudden terrifying responsibility. You watch her trace the edge of a black-bordered calling card with her thumb, her movements slow, deliberate, as if memorizing the exact texture of resolve. Mainstream historical records confirm that Anna stood at her mother's graveside in Fairmont, West Virginia, shortly after the funeral, and made a solemn vow to dedicate her life to establishing a day that would truly honor maternal sacrifice, not as a distant abstract sentiment, but as a personal, living legacy. The stiff root is drawing strength from the heavy soil of her loss, preparing to push something entirely new into the world. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in Anna's early personal correspondence that always makes modern archivists pause. During her deepest weeks of mourning, she refused to wear any jewelry except a small, hollow mourning locket filled with her mother's hair, and she kept it tied with a piece of stiff black ribbon that she allegedly never untied, not even to sleep. Imagine trying to fasten a delicate clasp behind your neck while your hands are trembling from exhaustion, only to realize the ribbon is basically welded to your collarbone from weeks of neglect. It's the early 1900s equivalent of wearing a comfort blanket to a formal event and refusing to explain why. You notice the locket resting on a side table beside a stack of unopened letters, its surface dull but undeniably present. The air in the room smells faintly of dried lavender, old paper, and the sharp, clean scent of rain on wet stone. You run a finger along the carved edge of a wooden sideboard, feeling the grooves where years of holiday visits once gathered. Now, there's only space for memory. You probably wouldn't survive a Victorian-era mourning period without at least one dramatic sigh into a lace handkerchief and a deep, abiding appreciation for modern grief counseling and breathable fabrics. Yet Anna's stillness isn't paralysis, it's incubation. The stiff root is drawing moisture from the heavy atmosphere, quietly mapping out the shape of what comes next. Historians still argue whether Anna's initial vow was a purely organic, spiritual response to personal loss, or a carefully constructed continuation of her mother's public health and community organizing work, subtly repurposing grassroots activism into formal commemoration. You lean back, listening to the slow, deliberate tick of a grandfather clock in the hall. Each second stretches, heavy and measured, like a pendulum marking the distance between raw sorrow and quiet purpose. Maybe the distinction doesn't matter. Maybe the truth lives in the quiet space where love and duty overlap, where a daughter's tears become the blueprint for a movement that will eventually touch millions. You watch Anna rise from her chair, her movements still stiff but gaining a new kind of fluidity. She walks to the writing desk, opens a shallow drawer, and pulls out a stack of crisp, cream-colored paper. The rustle of the sheets sounds like a promise waiting to be spoken. She doesn't light a gas lamp yet. She just sits in the dim afternoon light, letting the heavy silence settle around her like a well-worn shawl. You feel that familiar vibration starting low in your chest, the one that recognizes the exact moment before action, when grief stops pulling you under and starts giving you something solid to stand on. You shift in your seat, feeling the old springs of the sofa complain softly beneath you, a gentle reminder that even comfort has its limits. The room feels smaller now, but not in a suffocating way. In a focused way, like a camera lens tightening to catch a single, unwavering beam of light. Anna picks up a fountain pen, hesitates, then sets it down with a soft click. She isn't ready to write yet. The stiff root needs more time to act, more quiet to draw strength from the heavy memories of a woman who organized clubs, healed wounds, distributed herbs, and sat at neutral tables with former enemies. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the Philadelphia dusk settle over the room. Outside, a horse-drawn carriage clatters down the wet street, its iron-rimmed wheels hissing against the cobblestones, followed by the distant, muffled shout of a newsboy calling an evening headline. The sounds are far away, filtered through the heavy drapes, but they're a gentle reminder that the world keeps turning, even when your own feels suspended in amber. You probably wouldn't survive a week of 1905 Philadelphia spring without at least one sudden downpour, a misplaced parasol, and a firm belief that umbrellas were invented by a committee of pessimists. Yet here, in this quiet vigil, the weather doesn't matter, the timeline slows, the heavy silence becomes a canvas, and the stiff root begins to stretch, reaching upward toward the light that will soon become a campaign. You open your eyes, watch Anna's shoulders square just a fraction, and feel the quiet certainty that this stillness won't last forever. It's just gathering momentum, storing energy like a wound spring. You adjust your posture, let the heavy atmosphere wrap around you like a weighted blanket, and prepare to step into the next phase of the story, where silence will soon give way to sound, and morning will quietly begin to march. You feel the vibrating clatter before you even see the typewriter, a rhythmic, percussive tap-tap-tapping that seems to echo off the walls of a small Philadelphia apartment, turning grief into momentum. The year is 1906, and Anna Jarvis is no longer just mourning, she's mobilizing. You step into her workspace, a modest room cluttered with stacks of stationery, inkwells, reference books, and the faint, persistent scent of lavender water trying to mask the smell of stale coffee. Sunlight filters through lace curtains, catching dust motes that dance in the air like tiny, restless spirits. Anna sits at a sturdy oak desk, her posture stiff with purpose, her fingers flying across the keys of an Underwood No. 5. Each strike of the type bar is deliberate, weighted with conviction. You watch as a fresh sheet of paper emerges, the words crisp and black. A memorial Mother's Day, observed in the home and the church, would be a potent force for ennobling womanhood, strengthening the home, and promoting the highest interests of humanity. You probably wouldn't survive a week of Anna's letter-writing marathon without at least one ink-stained catastrophe, a severe case of writer's cramp, and a deep appreciation for the undo button. Yet here, in this quiet room, a one-woman campaign is beginning to ripple outward, one typed appeal at a time. Mainstream historical records confirm that Anna Jarvis launched an intensive letter-writing campaign shortly after her mother's death in 1905, targeting politicians, clergy, newspaper editors, and influential women's groups. She didn't just send polite requests, she crafted passionate, meticulously argued appeals that framed a national Mother's Day as both a moral imperative and a practical tool for social cohesion. Her letters were persuasive, persistent, and occasionally prickly, a combination that made them hard to ignore. You pick up a draft from her desk, the paper still warm from the typewriter, and read her words. There are many days for men. Why not one for mothers? It's a simple question, but it carries the weight of generations. You feel the vibration of her conviction in the very fibers of the page, as if the ink itself is humming with urgency. Anna's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Flood the system with so many reasoned appeals that the idea of a National Mother's Day becomes inevitable. like a seed that can't help but sprout given enough water and light. You probably wouldn't survive a day of early 20th century advocacy without at least one dramatic sigh, a misplaced comma that changes the entire meaning of a sentence, and a strong cup of tea to steady your nerves. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in archival notes that always makes modern researchers smile. Some of Anna's earliest letters were written on the back of unused funeral program inserts, turning symbols of personal loss into tools for public change. Imagine trying to craft a compelling argument for national holiday status while the ghost of a eulogy peers over your shoulder. It's the early 1900s equivalent of repurposing old social media drafts for a new cause, and you have to admire the resourcefulness. You glance at a stack of these repurposed sheets, their edges slightly frayed, the funeral text faintly visible beneath Anna's bold typewritten words. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful movements are built not from pristine beginnings, but from the careful reuse of what's already at hand. You run a finger over the raised ink of a particularly passionate paragraph, feeling the slight texture of the type, and wonder how many of these letters found their way into the hands of skeptical senators or busy editors. Did they pause, reading by lamplight, and feel that same vibration of conviction? You like to think some did. Historians still argue whether Anna Jarvis's relentless letter campaign was primarily a heartfelt tribute to her mother, or a calculated effort to establish her own legacy as a social reformer. You lean against the bookshelf, watching as Anna carefully addresses an envelope, her handwriting neat and precise despite the speed of her work. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the outcome, the way her words travelled, multiplied, and eventually took root in the national consciousness. You notice a small framed photograph on her desk. Anne Reeves Jarvis, looking gentle but resolute. Anna glances at it briefly before returning to her typing, and you see the flicker of emotion in her eyes. Not just grief, but determination, love, and a touch of that stiff pride that comes from carrying forward a parent's dream. The room fills with the steady tap-tap-tap of the typewriter, a sound that's both mechanical and deeply human, like a heartbeat translated into language. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional labour of channeling personal loss into public action without at least one good cry into a handkerchief and a very long walk to clear your head. As the afternoon light begins to soften, casting long shadows across the desk, Anna pauses to review her work. She reads a letter aloud, her voice low but clear, testing the rhythm of her arguments. "Let us honour the person who has done more for you than anyone in the world," she says, and the words hang in the air, simple but profound. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognises purpose when it's quiet, persistent, and utterly necessary. She folds the letter, seals it with wax, and adds it to a growing pile ready for the post. Each envelope is a small act of faith, a vote for a future where mothers are honoured not just in private, but in the public square. You watch as she ties the bundle with twine, her movements efficient but tender, as if each letter is a child being sent out into the world with a prayer. The clatter of the typewriter has stopped, but the vibration lingers, humming in the quiet room like the echo of a bell that's just been struck. You think about how Anna's stationary war echoes the earlier traditions you've witnessed. The Phrygian drums that vibrated through mountain stone, the Roman cymbals that echoed off aqueducts, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the West Virginia work clubs that fought disease with heavy determination, the neutral tea table where grief softened into hope. All of it has led to this moment, to a small apartment in Philadelphia, where a daughter's love is being translated into typed words, sent out like seeds on the wind. You probably wouldn't survive the bureaucratic labyrinth of early 20th century politics without at least one lost letter, a misaddressed envelope, and a deep appreciation for the postal service. Yet Anna persists, her campaign growing with each passing month, each new ally, each published editorial that picks up her cause. You feel the weighted appeal of her words in your own hands, as if you're holding one of those letters, feeling the slight texture of the paper, the crisp impression of the type. It's a reminder that change often starts not with a shout, but with a steady vibrating whisper that refuses to be silenced. As evening approaches, Anna lights a small oil lamp on her desk, its warm glow pushing back the gathering darkness. She doesn't seem tired, not yet. There's a fire in her eyes, a quiet intensity that feels both heavy and light, like a flame that burns steadily without consuming itself. You watch as she begins a new letter, this one addressed to a prominent clergyman in Washington. Her fingers find the keys with practiced ease, and the tap-tap-tap resumes, a lullaby of advocacy. You step back toward the window, looking out at the Philadelphia street below, where gas lamps are beginning to flicker to life, and the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages mixes with the occasional shout of a newsboy. The city is alive, moving, changing. And somewhere in this web of streets and stories, Anna's letters are travelling, finding their way into hands that might just listen. You feel ready for whatever comes next, carrying with you the vibrating truth that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with armies or laws, but with a single person, a typewriter, and the stubborn weighted belief that a mother's love deserves to be honoured by the world. You adjust your shawl against the evening chill, take one last look at the room where history is being typed into existence, and prepare to step into the next chapter of this long, winding story. You step through the wooden doors of Andrews Methodist Church in Grafton, West Virginia, and the air hits you first, a cool, still breath scented with old wood, beeswax, and something sweeter, almost intoxicating. It's May 10, 1908, just after dawn, and the morning light filters through the stained glass windows in soft bars of ruby and amber, catching dust motes that swirl like tiny reverent dancers. The pews are stiff beneath your palms as you slide into a seat near the back, the wood smooth from generations of Sunday bests and quiet prayers. You can feel the weight of the moment in the hush of the congregation, in the way people adjust their collars and smooth their skirts with deliberate care. This isn't just another service. This is the first official observance of a day that will eventually ripple across oceans and centuries, and you probably wouldn't survive a 1908 church service without at least one awkward elbow nudge during hymn singing, a sudden craving for coffee that won't be invented for another decade, and a deep appreciation for the miracle of central heating. Yet here, in this quiet sanctuary, something new is being born, and the air itself seems to hold its breath. At the front, near the simple wooden altar, a large basket overflows with white carnations, their petals crisp and perfect, their stems wrapped in damp cloth to keep them fresh. Anna Jarvis stands nearby, her expression calm but focused, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she helps distribute the flowers. Mainstream historical records confirm that on this day, May 10, 1908, Anna organised the first official Mother's Day service at Andrews Methodist Episcopal Church, distributing exactly 500 white carnations, one for every mother in the congregation. The choice wasn't random. White carnations were her mother Anne Reeves Jarvis's favourite flower, and Anna selected them as a living symbol of purity, endurance, and the quiet, steadfast love that defines maternal care. You watch as an elderly woman accepts a bloom with trembling hands, her eyes glistening as she pins it to her lapel. The gesture is simple, but it carries the weight of generations. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional labour of receiving a flower that represents both celebration and remembrance, without at least one discreet sniffle into a handkerchief and a sudden urge to call your own mother, if you could. The sweetness of 500 carnations in a small church is basically the Victorian equivalent of an essential oil diffuser set to overwhelm. It's not unpleasant exactly, but it's potent, a heady, spicy fragrance that wraps around you like a warm shawl and lingers in the back of your throat. You take a slow breath, letting the scent settle, and notice how it seems to soften the edges of the room, blurring the line between the sacred and the personal. A child near the front fidgets slightly, reaching up to touch the petals of the carnation pinned to her mother's dress, and you smile at the universal truth of it. Even in the most solemn moments, curiosity finds a way. You glance around the nave, taking in the faces, some softly, some tearful, all present in a way that feels intentional, weighted. This isn't a passive audience. It's a community participating in the creation of something new. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes hope when it's quiet, persistent, and utterly necessary. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in local oral histories that always makes modern researchers smile. Some accounts suggest Anna personally selected each of the 500 carnations at dawn, checking every bloom for perfect petals and discarding any with even a hint of pink or yellow, creating a small mountain of rejected flowers that local children later used for pretend tea parties in the churchyard. Imagine trying to inspect 500 flowers while your hands are still stiff from the morning chill and your heart is racing with the significance of the day. It's the early 1900s equivalent of curating a Pinterest board for a very important event, and you have to admire the attention to detail. You notice a few stray petals on the floor near the altar, their edges slightly curled, and wonder how many small hands have already tucked them into pockets or pressed them between the pages of hymnals as quiet souvenirs. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound traditions begin with a little bit of fussiness and a lot of love. Historians still argue whether the choice of white carnations was primarily personal, a tribute to Anna Jarvis's favourite flower, or deeply symbolic, representing the purity, endurance, and untouched nature of idealized maternal love in the cultural imagination of the era. You lean back against the stiff pew, watching as Anna moves down the aisle, offering a carnation to each mother with a quiet word and a gentle nod. Maybe the answer isn't either or. Maybe the magic is in the overlap, the way a personal gesture can become a universal symbol, like a single note that resonates across a whole symphony. You feel the weight of that possibility in the air, vibrating alongside the scent of flowers and the soft murmur of prayer. You probably wouldn't survive a morning of 1908 floral diplomacy without at least one accidental petal crush, a misplaced pin that pricks your finger, and a deep appreciation for the invention of safety pins. The service begins in earnest, and the congregation rises to sing. The hymn is familiar, its melody weaving through the carnation-scented air like a thread of gold. You join in softly, your voice blending with the others, and feel the vibration of the music in your ribs, in the floorboards, in the very stones of the church. It's a sound that feels both ancient and brand new, like a river that's been flowing for centuries, but has just discovered a new channel. You watch as a young mother near the front holds her carnation close, her eyes closed as she sings, and you see the flicker of emotion on her face. Not just gratitude, but recognition, as if she's just realized that her daily, often unseen labor is being honored in this quiet, public way. The moment feels fragile but powerful, like a soap bubble catching the light. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional weight of being seen in your motherhood without at least one happy tear and a sudden urge to bake cookies for no reason other than that you can. As the service draws to a close, Anna steps forward to speak. Her voice is calm, clear, and carries easily in the quiet space. She doesn't preach or lecture. She simply shares a memory of her mother, a story of quiet strength and practical love. A mother, she says, is the person who has done more for you than anyone in the world. The words hang in the air, simple but profound, and you feel them land somewhere deep in your own posture. The congregation responds with a soft, collective murmur of agreement, and you notice how the carnations seem to glow a little brighter in the morning light, as if absorbing the sentiment. You think about the Phrygian drums that vibrated through mountain stone, the Roman cymbals that echoed off aqueducts, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the West Virginia work clubs that fought disease with heavy determination, the neutral tea table where grief softened into hope, and the Philadelphia apartment where a daughter's grief was typed into action. All of it has led to this moment, to a small church in West Virginia where 500 white carnations mark the birth of a new tradition. You feel ready for whatever comes next, carrying with you the toxic sweetness of the flowers, the stiff comfort of the pews, and the quiet certainty that sometimes the most enduring legacies begin with a single perfect bloom. You adjust your posture, let the morning light warm your face, and prepare to step into the next chapter of this long, winding story. You leave the vibrating clatter of Anna's typewriter behind and feel the ground shift beneath your feet. The quiet Philadelphia apartment dissolving into the broad, more turbulent landscape of a nation still healing from civil war. The air grows heavier, charged with the unresolved tensions of Reconstruction, the echoes of battlefield drums, and the quiet, persistent hope that maybe, just maybe, mothers could offer a different path forward. You're trudging now through the weighted words of Julia Ward Howe's 1870 Mother's Day Proclamation, and the language itself feels like a landscape you have to walk through, dense with moral urgency, layered with poetic conviction, and vibrating with a call to action that refuses to be ignored. You probably wouldn't survive a full reading of 19th century feminist manifestos without at least one dramatic pause to stretch your neck, a sudden craving for a snack to break the intensity, and a deep appreciation for the invention of bullet points. Yet here, in the space between Howe's carefully chosen phrases, you feel the heavy pull of a vision that asks mothers to rise not just as nurturers of children, but as architects of peace. The proclamation opens with a line that lands like a stone in still water. "Arise then, women of this day." You can almost hear Howe's voice, clear and resonant, cutting through the parlor room conversations and newspaper editorials of post-war America. She doesn't whisper, she declares. And as you move deeper into the text, you feel the weight of her argument building, layer upon layer. She calls on mothers to unite across national boundaries, to reject the glorification of war, to recognize that the same hands that cradle infants can also hold the tools of diplomacy, of education, of quiet, persistent resistance. Mainstream historical records confirm that Julia Ward Howe, best known for writing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, penned this proclamation in 1870 as a direct response to the carnage of the Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War, urging women to organize a Congress of Women dedicated to promoting peaceful resolution of international conflicts. It wasn't just a poem or a prayer, it was a political blueprint, weighted with the conviction that maternal love, when channeled collectively, could reshape the world. You run your fingers over a facsimile of the original document, feeling the slight texture of the aged paper, and wonder how many women read those words by lamplight, their hearts quickening with the possibility of a different future. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in Howe's personal journals that always makes modern researchers smile. Some entries suggest she drafted early versions of the proclamation while rocking her youngest child to sleep, weaving the rhythm of the lullaby into the cadence of her arguments. Imagine trying to craft a powerful call for global peace while simultaneously shushing a toddler who just discovered the joy of throwing spoons. It's the 19th century equivalent of writing a keynote speech during a Zoom call with your kids in the background. And you have to admire the multitasking. You notice a faint smudge of what might be jam or ink near the margin of a draft page, and you can't help but picture Howe pausing mid-sentence to wipe a sticky finger on her apron before returning to her revolutionary prose. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound ideas are born not in isolated towers of thought, but in the beautiful, messy reality of daily life. Historians still argue whether Howe's proclamation was primarily a genuine call for maternal political mobilization, or a strategic rhetorical device designed to leverage the cultural authority of motherhood to advance broader feminist and pacifist goals without triggering immediate backlash. You lean against a bookshelf in a quiet reading room, watching dust motes dance in a shaft of afternoon light as you ponder the question. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the impact. The way her words created a space for women to imagine themselves as agents of peace, to see the domestic roles not as limitations but as foundations for public action. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes courage when it's quiet, persistent, and utterly necessary. You probably wouldn't survive a day of 1870s activist networking without at least one awkward introduction, a misplaced comment about the weather, and a deep appreciation for the invention of the calendar invite. As you continue trudging through the weighted language of the proclamation, you notice how Howe's vision pulses with a moral urgency that feels both heavy and light, heavy in its recognition of the stakes, light in its belief in the possibility of change. She writes of the great and general interest of women in promoting the alliance of different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, and you feel the vibrating thread of hope that runs through even the most sober passages. It's not naive optimism, it's grounded conviction, the kind that comes from witnessing both the worst and the best of human nature. You think about the Phrygian drums that vibrated through mountain stone, the Roman cymbals that echoed off aqueducts, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the West Virginia work clubs that fought disease with heavy determination, the neutral tea table where grief softened into hope, the Philadelphia vigil where a daughter's grief took stiff root, the carnation dawn where 500 white blooms marked a new beginning, and the stationery war where typed words became seeds of change. All of it has led to this moment, to a proclamation that asks mothers to see themselves not just as caretakers of the home, but as stewards of the world. You pause near a window, watching the late afternoon light gild the edges of the clouds, and let Howe's words settle in your bones. Let them first consult as to what means can be adopted for the general fellowship of women in the promotion of peace. The sentence is simple, but its implications are vast. It's an invitation to organize, to collaborate, to build networks of care that extend beyond family and community to encompass the whole of humanity. You probably wouldn't survive the logistical challenges of 19th century international organizing without at least one lost letter, a miscommunication about time zones that don't officially exist yet, and a firm belief that carrier pigeons were underrated. Yet Howe's vision persists, vibrating in the quiet space between her words, inviting you to imagine a world where maternal wisdom is not sidelined, but centered in the work of peace-building. You feel the heavy responsibility of that invitation, but also the lightness of possibility, the sense that even small actions, when multiplied, can shift the course of history. As the light begins to soften, casting long shadows across the room, you close the facsimile of the proclamation and take a slow breath. The air feels different now, charged with the quiet energy of a call that has been heard, even if its full answer is still unfolding. You think about how Howe's vision echoes in modern movements for peace, for climate justice, for community care, any space where the ethic of nurturing is extended to the broader world. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of holding both hope and grief without at least one good cry in the shower, a very long walk in the rain, and a deep appreciation for the friends who show up with soup and silence. Yet here, in the weighted space of Howe's words, you feel a sense of continuity, a vibrating thread that connects the past to the present, the personal to the political, the quiet act of mothering to the loud work of changing the world. You adjust your posture, let the heavy urgency of the proclamation settle into a comfortable resolve, and prepare to step into the next chapter of this long, winding story, where a private prayer will soon become federal law. You feel the shift before you see it. The quiet hum of anticipation in a Washington, D.C. office building on a crisp May afternoon in 1914. The air is stiff with formality, weighted with the gravity of a moment that has been years in the making. You step into the Oval Office, or rather, the 1914 version of it, wood-panelled walls, heavy drapes, the faint scent of leather and pipe tobacco lingering like a polite ghost. President Woodrow Wilson sits at the resolute desk, his posture precise, his expression calm but focused. Before him lies a single sheet of paper, Joint Resolution H.J. Res. 263. You probably wouldn't survive a formal presidential signing ceremony without at least one awkward cough at the wrong moment, a sudden urge to adjust your collar for the 10th time, and a deep appreciation for the invention of the silent applause emoji. Yet here, in this quiet room, a private prayer is about to become federal law, and the weight of that transformation hangs in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. Mainstream historical records confirm that on May 8, 1914, President Woodrow Wilson signed the joint resolution designating the second Sunday in May as Mother's Day, urging its observance as a public expression of our love and reverence for the mothers of our country. It wasn't a grand spectacle or a media circus. It was a deliberate, bureaucratic act, weighted with the conviction that honouring motherhood was a matter of national importance. You watch as Wilson picks up a fountain pen, dips it carefully into an inkwell, and pauses for just a moment, long enough for the room to hold its breath. Then, with a steady hand, he signs. The scratch of nib on paper is soft but distinct, a sound that feels both ordinary and monumental, like the closing of a chapter and the opening of a new one in the same breath. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes history being made not with fanfare, but with focus. You probably wouldn't survive the pressure of witnessing a presidential signature without at least one nervous fidget and a sudden craving for a cookie to steady your hands. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in White House archives that always makes modern researchers smile. Some accounts suggest Wilson used a special gold-nibbed pen for the signing, which was later presented to Anna Jarvis as a token of gratitude. But Anna, in her characteristic blend of grace and prickliness, reportedly kept it in a drawer for years before finally donating it to a historical society, with a note that read, "For the record, not for display." Imagine receiving a presidential pen as a gift, and then basically putting it in time out for a decade, because you're not sure it deserves the spotlight. It's the early 1900s equivalent of getting a fancy award, and then storing it in a closet because you're worried it'll distract from the cause. You notice a small, ornate inkstand on the desk, its surface polished to a soft gleam, and wonder how many other historic documents have been born from that same humble tool. It's a reminder that sometimes the most enduring legacies are signed with the same instruments used for grocery lists and love letters. Historians still argue whether Wilson's signing was primarily a genuine endorsement of maternal honor or a strategic political move designed to appeal to the growing influence of women's groups ahead of the suffrage movement's final push. You lean against a bookshelf lined with leather-bound volumes, watching the late afternoon light filter through the windows and cast long, dignified shadows across the carpet. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the outcome. The way a single signature transformed a grassroots campaign into a national observance, giving Anna Jarvis's vision the weight of federal recognition. You feel the heavy significance of that moment settling into the room, vibrating alongside the quiet tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. You probably wouldn't survive the bureaucratic labyrinth of early 20th century legislation without at least one lost document, a misfiled memo, and a deep appreciation for the people who actually understand how committees work. As Wilson sets down the pen, he looks up briefly, his expression softening just slightly. He doesn't give a speech or call for applause. He simply nods, as if acknowledging the quiet power of the act he's just completed. You watch as an aide carefully blots the ink, folds the resolution with practiced precision, and places it in a leather portfolio. The process is efficient, almost ritualistic, and you realize that this is how change often happens in the halls of power. Not with fireworks, but with paperwork. Not with shouts, but with signatures. You think about the Phrygian drums that vibrated through mountain stone, the Roman cymbals that echoed off aqueducts, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the West Virginia work clubs that fought disease with heavy determination, the neutral tea table where grief softened into hope, the Philadelphia vigil where a daughter's grief took stiff root, the Carnation Dawn where 500 white blooms marked a new beginning, the Stationery War where typed words became seeds of change, and the Peace Proclamation where mothers were called to unite against war. All of it has led to this moment, to a quiet office in Washington, where a president's pen stroke transforms a heavy private prayer into federal law. You step toward the window, looking out at the Washington skyline, where the Capitol dome gleams in the late afternoon sun, and the distant chatter of the city rises like a gentle hum. The air feels different now, charged with the quiet energy of a law that will ripple outward, touching millions of lives in ways no one in this room can fully predict. You probably wouldn't survive the ripple effects of federal holiday status without at least one confused calendar update, a misplaced greeting card, and a firm belief that time zones were invented by someone who really liked to complicate dinner plans. Yet here, in this stiff, formal moment, you feel the vibrating possibility of what's to come. The way a single act of recognition can become a cultural touchstone, a shared ritual, a day when people pause, however briefly, to honor the nurturing forces in their lives. As the light begins to soften, casting a golden glow over the desk and the portfolio that now holds the signed resolution, you take a slow breath. The room feels both heavier and lighter here, with the weight of history, lighter with the promise of what this law might enable. You think about how Wilson's pen stroke echoes in modern celebrations. Even if we've swapped formal resolutions for social media posts and handwritten letters for digital greetings, the core impulse remains to create a space, however small, for gratitude, for recognition, for the quiet acknowledgement that some bonds are worth honoring out loud. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of holding both tradition and change without at least one good cry during a Hallmark commercial, a very long walk to clear your head, and a deep appreciation for the friends who remind you that it's okay to feel complicated about holidays. Yet here, in the quiet aftermath of a signature, you feel a sense of continuity, a vibrating thread that connects the personal to the political, the private to the public, the heavy work of advocacy to the light touch of celebration. You adjust your posture, let the stiff formality of the moment settle into a comfortable resolve, and prepare to step into the next chapter of this long, winding story, where symbols will deepen, silence will speak, and the shift toward commerce will begin to reshape the very tradition Anna Jarvis fought so hard to create. You take one last look at the desk, the pen, the portfolio, and feel the quiet certainty that this isn't an ending, it's a threshold. You probably wouldn't survive the next phase of cultural evolution without at least one ironic comment about greeting cards, a sudden craving for flowers that aren't on sale, and a firm belief that the best traditions are the ones we keep reimagining. Yet for now, in this stiff, weighted, vibrating moment, you let the significance of Wilson's pen stroke settle into your bones, and you prepare to walk forward, carrying with you the heavy truth that sometimes the most enduring changes begin with a single, deliberate stroke of ink. You trudge through early 20th century floral markets, where the air is so thick with petal dust, damp soil, and the faint tang of cut stems it practically clings to your coat like a second skin. The temperature drops a few degrees under the vaulted glass and iron ceiling, and you feel the heavy chill seep through your boots as you navigate narrow aisles flanked by wooden crates overflowing with greenery, tightly wound bundles of moss, and buckets of water that ripple with every passing step. Everywhere you look, hands move with practiced rhythmic precision, snipping wire, tying twine, wrapping paper in sharp, satisfying creases. But your eyes keep returning to one particular bloom, repeated in endless variations across every stall and every vendor's apron, the carnation. You probably wouldn't survive an afternoon navigating floral market etiquette without accidentally misreading a color code, buying the wrong shade for your grandmother, and ending up apologizing profusely to a perfectly healthy relative over tea. Yet here, beneath the humming roof, the carnation isn't just a flower. It's a language weighted with meaning, carefully calibrated to speak what words sometimes fail to hold. The air carries a sweetness that borders on overwhelming, a cloying, almost toxic fragrance that hangs low near the wet stick-from floor and rises in warm waves whenever a vendor lifts a fresh bundle. It's not unpleasant exactly, but it's potent enough to make your head swim if you linger too long in one spot. You run a finger along the damp edge of a wooden crate, feeling the splintered grain and the faint residue of sap, and watch as a florist carefully separates a stack of pristine white blooms from a cluster of deep crimson and soft pink ones. Mainstream historical records confirm that by the 1910s, the color-coded carnation had become the official visual shorthand for Mother's Day observances. White pinned to a lapel or corsage to honor a mother who had passed, red or pink worn proudly to celebrate a living mother. It was a system born from Anna Jarvis's original tribute at Andrews Methodist Church, but it had already evolved into a rigid social grammar. You notice how customers approach the stalls with a quiet reverence, speaking in low tones, selecting their flowers not on a whim but with deliberate, almost ceremonial care. The gesture feels heavy with responsibility, weighted by the knowledge that a single bloom carries a public declaration of love, loss, or lineage. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional labor of selecting the correct flower in front of a row of waiting vendors without at least one nervous cough, a misplaced coin drop, and a sudden urge to buy 3 of everything just to avoid making a choice. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in early floral trade catalogues that always makes modern botanists smirk. Some wholesale growers actually experimented with early dyeing techniques to achieve richer reds, using mild iron salts and vegetable pigments that sometimes left a faint, metallic tang on the stems, requiring florists to wrap the cut ends in damp moss before arranging them. Imagine trying to maintain the illusion of a perfectly natural bloom while your fingers are slightly stained and the water bucket smells like a blacksmith's workshop. It's the early 20th century equivalent of airbrushing reality, and you have to admire the theatrical commitment. You watch a young woman carefully examine a crimson carnation, turning it slowly to check the petal edges, her thumb brushing against the slightly rough sepals. The florist nods in silent approval, tying the stem with a narrow ribbon before handing it over with both hands. The exchange is brief but deeply ritualized, a quiet passing of symbols in a market where sentiment has been carefully priced, packaged, and prepared for delivery. You feel the weight of that transaction in your own chest, the heavy certainty that even the most intimate gestures have a way of becoming public, visible, shared. Historians still argue whether the strict white fessa pink carnation code was Anna Jarvis's intentional design to honor both grief and joy within a single tradition, or if it was largely a pragmatic marketing framework adopted by the floral trade that she later endorsed for the sake of uniformity. You lean against a cast-iron support column, letting the cool metal ground you as you watch the market pulse with quiet industry. Maybe the distinction doesn't need a tidy resolution. Maybe the power lies in the ambiguity itself, the way a community can agree on a visual shorthand without needing to untangle every origin thread. You notice how the white blooms seem to catch the diffused glass roof light differently than the red ones, appearing almost luminous, almost weightless, until you remember the heavy memories they're meant to carry. It's a paradox that fits the era perfectly. A tradition that honors both the vibrancy of life and the quiet permanence of absence, pinned to the same coat lapel, depending on whose name you whisper before you button it. You probably wouldn't survive a morning of 1920s floral diplomacy without at least one misdirected compliment, a dropped hat pin, and a deep appreciation for the invention of clipped-on corsages. You move deeper into the market, where the humidity rises and the scent of damp earth mixes with the faint green aroma of freshly cut stalks. Stalls give way to sorting tables, where workers' grade and tie blooms into dozens, their hands moving with a vibrating efficiency that feels almost hypnotic. You hear the soft rustle of tissue paper, the sharp snip of shears, the low murmur of bartering in 3 different languages, and beneath it all, that steady, rhythmic clatter of commerce that has been packaging human affection for centuries. The carnations here aren't just flowers, they're tokens, messengers, quiet ambassadors of a ritual that has already outgrown the church pews of West Virginia and the quiet parlors of Philadelphia. You think about the Phrygian smoke that once carried prayers up mountain slopes, the Roman petals tossed into parades, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the neutral tea tables where former enemies shared grief, Anna's vibrating typewriter, Wilson's stiff pen stroke, and now this, a market where love is measured in dozens, wrapped in damp paper, and sold with a polite nod. The transition isn't jarring, it's gradual, inevitable, like water finding its own level. You feel that familiar vibration in your ribs, the one that recognizes how sacred gestures inevitably brush against the everyday. How the deeply personal slowly learns to wear a price tag. A vendor catches your eye and offers a small, pre-wrapped white bloom on a short wooden pick, the kind meant to be tucked into a hatband or pinned near the collar. You take it, feeling the cool weight of the petals against your palm, and notice how the stem has been trimmed and sealed with a drop of wax to preserve its freshness. The gesture is simple, almost mundane, but it carries the heavy gravity of 1,000 unspoken acknowledgements. You slip it into your coat pocket, where it rests against the lining like a quiet promise, its toxic, sweet fragrance slowly weaving itself into the fabric. You probably wouldn't survive a century of floral symbolism without at least one wilted lapel pin, a slightly crooked ribbon, and a firm belief that nature was never meant to be color-coded. Yet here, in the damp, echoing aisles of the market, the code feels less like a rule and more like a rhythm, a way for people to signal their place in the lineage of care, to wear their history openly, to let strangers know without a single word who they're carrying with them today. You adjust your collar, feel the cool glass air settle into your lungs, and prepare to follow the trail of wrapped stems and damp crates toward the next quiet evolution of this tradition, where ink and paper will soon take over the work that flowers began. You leave the damp, petal-scented aisles of the floral market behind and step into the warm, lamplit quiet of a family parlor, where the air smells of beeswax, old paper, and the faint, comforting tang of ink. The table is stiff with ritual, a heavy oak surface polished to a soft sheen, covered with a crisp linen cloth, scattered with inkwells, blotting paper, quills, and the occasional nervous smudge of a child's handprint. You settle into a high-backed chair that creaks softly under your weight, feeling the familiar resistance of wood that has supported generations of quiet contemplation. Around you, family members gather, not in a crowd, but in a deliberate, weighted circle, each person selecting a pen, dipping it carefully, pausing to gather their thoughts before the nib meets the page. You probably wouldn't survive a 1910s family letter writing session without at least one dramatic ink spill, a poorly chosen word that requires 3 layers of blotting paper to fix, and a deep appreciation for the invention of spell check. Yet here, in this stiff, intentional moment, affection is being translated into ink, and every stroke carries a vibration that mass production will soon struggle to replicate. Mainstream historical records confirm that before the rise of commercial greeting cards in the 1920s, Mother's Day observances often centered on the handwritten letter, a personal, labor-intensive gesture where children and spouses would gather to pen heartfelt notes, sharing stories, gratitude, and quiet promises. These weren't rushed postcards or pre-printed sentiments. They were heavy with deliberation, weighted with the knowledge that the recipient would hold this physical trace of your hand, your thoughts, your time. You watch as a young boy carefully forms each letter, his tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth in concentration, while his older sister drafts a longer note, pausing occasionally to stare out the window as if pulling memories from the twilight. The ink itself seems to hum on the page, not literally of course, but in the way it captures a moment of focused love, a vibrating thread of connection that will travel through the postal system to land in a mother's hands, still warm with intention. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional labor of crafting the perfect handwritten tribute without at least one crumpled draft, a sudden crisis of confidence about your penmanship, and a firm belief that cursive was invented by someone who really liked to complicate grocery lists. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in family archives and stationery catalogues that always makes modern calligraphers smile. Some households practiced a gentle form of ink blending, where multiple family members would contribute to a single letter, father writing the opening, children adding middle paragraphs, mother signing at the end, creating a collaborative document that literally carried the handwriting of an entire family. Imagine trying to coordinate that without smudging each other's work, or accidentally writing over someone's carefully crafted metaphor about daffodils. It's the early 20th century equivalent of a shared Google Doc, minus the version history and the passive-aggressive comment bubbles. You notice a letter on the table where the ink shifts subtly in tone and pressure mid-paragraph, and you can almost feel the passing of the pen from one hand to another, a quiet relay of affection. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound gestures are also the most collaborative, that love doesn't always need a single author to be deeply felt. Historians still argue whether the tradition of handwritten Mother's Day letters was primarily a grassroots, organic expression of familial gratitude, or a subtly encouraged practice promoted by stationery manufacturers and postal services to boost seasonal sales of paper, ink, and stamps. You lean back in your creaking chair, watching the lamplight catch the faint sheen of wet ink on a freshly written page, and ponder the question. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the experience. The way the act of writing by hand forces a slower, more deliberate form of communication, where every word is chosen, every comma considered, every flourish a tiny act of care. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes how the physicality of a gesture can deepen its emotional resonance. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of balancing authenticity with tradition without at least one good cry over a faded letter, a very long walk to clear your head, and a deep appreciation for the friends who still send handwritten notes just because. As the evening deepens, the parlor grows quieter. The only sounds the soft scratch of nib on paper, the occasional rustle of a page being turned, and the gentle hiss of the oil lamp. You pick up your own pen, feeling the cool weight of the barrel in your fingers, and dip it into the inkwell. The ink is dark, almost black, with a slight blue undertone that catches the light as you lift the nib. You hover it over the blank page for a moment, letting the stiff ritual settle into your bones, and then you begin to write. The first word feels heavy, weighted with the responsibility of capturing something true, something lasting. But as you continue, the vibration of the gesture takes over, the rhythm of your hand, the flow of your thoughts, the quiet certainty that this page will travel, will be held, will be remembered. You think about the Phrygian drums that vibrated through mountain stone, the Roman petals tossed into parades, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the neutral tea tables where grief softened into hope, Anna's vibrating typewriter, Wilson's stiff pen stroke, the weighted carnation code, and now this. A parlour where ink becomes a vessel for affection, where the stiff ritual of writing carries a vibration that no machine can fully replicate. You probably wouldn't survive the postal journey of a 1910s letter without at least one weather delay, a slightly smudged address, and a firm belief that mail carriers were basically wizards who could navigate any storm. You finish your note, blot the ink carefully, and fold the page with deliberate precision, tucking it into an envelope that you address in your neatest hand. The process feels almost ceremonial, each step weighted with the knowledge that this small packet of paper will carry your voice across miles, across time, to land in the hands of someone who matters. You seal the envelope with a dab of wax, pressing your thumb into the soft surface to leave a faint personal mark. It's not a signature exactly, but it's a trace, a quiet assertion of presence. You place the letter on the growing pile near the door, ready for tomorrow's post, and feel a sense of completion that's both heavy and light, heavy, with the responsibility of having spoken your truth, light with the relief of having set it free. You probably wouldn't survive the anticipation of waiting for a reply without at least one nervous glance out the window, a sudden craving for cookies to soothe the suspense, and a deep appreciation for the invention of read receipts, even if they do sometimes cause more anxiety than they relieve. As the lamp begins to gutter, casting long, dancing shadows across the parlour, the family starts to stir, gathering their things, exchanging quiet goodnights, the stiff ritual giving way to the comfortable rhythm of bedtime. You stand, feeling the pleasant ache in your fingers from writing, the slight stiffness in your shoulders from leaning over the table, and you take one last look at the scene, the inkwells, the blotting paper, the pile of letters waiting to travel, the quiet satisfaction on everyone's faces. The air still carries the faint scent of ink and beeswax, a combination that feels both old-fashioned and deeply human. You think about how this stiff, heavy, vibrating ritual will soon be altered by the rise of mass-produced greeting cards, by industrial presses and pre-written sentiments, by the convenience that often comes at the cost of intimacy. But for now, in this lamplit parlour, the handwritten letter still holds its ground, a quiet testament to the power of slowing down, of choosing words with care, of letting ink carry affection in a way that no algorithm can fully replicate. You adjust your collar, feel the cool night air seep in through the window, and prepare to step into the next chapter of this long, winding story, where greenhouses and industrial presses will soon systematize sentiment, turning love into a product with a price tag. You trudge through the heavy humidity of a 1920s greenhouse, and the air hits you like a warm, damp blanket woven from soil, fertilizer, and the cloying sweetness of 1,000 carnations in various stages of bloom. The glass panels overhead are fogged with condensation, diffusing the morning light into a soft, milky glow that makes everything feel slightly dreamlike, slightly unreal. Your boots sink into the damp earth path, and you can feel the vibration of activity all around you. The soft shuffle of workers moving between rows, the rhythmic snip of shears, the low murmur of instructions passed in a half-dozen languages. You probably wouldn't survive an hour in this tropical microclimate without at least one dramatic fogging of your glasses, a sudden craving for ice water that isn't available for another 3 decades, and a deep appreciation for the invention of air conditioning. Yet here, beneath the curved glass ceiling, sentiment is being systematized, love is being cultivated on schedule, and the heavy work of turning affection into inventory is underway with vibrating efficiency. Mainstream historical records confirm that by the early 1920s, the floral industry had begun to professionalize Mother's Day preparations, with large-scale greenhouses in states like California, Florida, and New Jersey coordinating planting schedules, temperature controls, and shipping logistics to ensure a reliable supply of carnations for the second Sunday in May. It wasn't just gardening anymore. It was agricultural engineering, weighted with the knowledge that a missed bloom could mean a missed profit margin, a disappointed customer, a tradition slightly tarnished. You watch as a foreman checks a clipboard, his pencil tapping against the paper as he compares the colour and size of blooms against a strict grading chart. White carnations must be pure, unblemished, perfectly formed. Red and pink ones must show vibrant, consistent hue. Anything less is set aside for lesser occasions, for bouquets that don't carry the heavy symbolism of maternal honour. You probably wouldn't survive the pressure of meeting 1920s floral quality standards without at least one nervous glance at a slightly crooked petal, a whispered prayer for favourable weather, and a firm belief that perfection was invented by someone who never actually grew anything. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in old horticultural trade journals that always makes modern botanists smirk. Some greenhouse operators experimented with early bloom delay techniques, using controlled temperature drops and adjusted light exposure to hold carnations in tight bud until just days before Mother's Day, ensuring peak freshness for delivery. Imagine trying to convince a flower to wait its turn while your entire business depends on it blooming exactly on schedule. It's the 1920s equivalent of managing a very temperamental influencer who only shows up for photo shoots under specific lighting conditions. You notice a row of plants near the back of the greenhouse, their buds still tightly closed, wrapped in delicate paper sleeves to protect them from accidental bruising. A worker moves past with a watering can, humming softly, and you catch the faint scent of damp earth and green stems, mixing with the sweeter fragrance of open blooms. It's a reminder that even in an age of industrial efficiency, nature still has its own rhythm, its own stubbornness, its own quiet way of reminding humans that not everything can be perfectly scheduled. Historians still argue whether the floral industry's early standardization of Mother's Day blooms was primarily a pragmatic response to growing consumer demand, or a deliberate strategy to shape and commodify the tradition in ways that Anna Jarvis never intended. You lean against a wooden support beam, feeling the cool, damp wood against your palm, as you watch workers carefully wrap dozens of carnations in waxed paper, tie them with ribbon, and stack them into shipping crates lined with moist sphagnum moss. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the outcome, the way a personal grassroots gesture gradually became a national commercial event, with supply chains and marketing campaigns and price fluctuations that mirrored any other seasonal commodity. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes how even the most heartfelt traditions can brush against the machinery of commerce, how the deeply personal can slowly learn to wear a price tag. You probably wouldn't survive the logistical complexity of 1920s floral distribution without at least one misrouted crate, a slightly wilted shipment, and a deep appreciation for the postal workers who somehow kept it all moving. The humidity rises as you move deeper into the greenhouse, and the air grows thicker with the scent of blooming flowers, damp soil, and the faint metallic tang of the irrigation system. Workers move with a vibrating efficiency that feels almost hypnotic, snipping stems at precise angles, removing lower leaves to prevent rot, arranging blooms by colour and size with a speed that suggests years of practice. You notice how the carnations themselves seem to respond to the careful attention, their petals unfurling with a quiet confidence, their stems standing straight and strong. It's a partnership, of sorts, between human intention and botanical possibility, a collaboration that turns sentiment into something tangible, something that can be wrapped, shipped, and pinned to a lapel with a quiet nod of recognition. You think about the Phrygian smoke that once carried prayers up mountain slopes, the Roman petals tossed into parades, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the neutral tea tables where former enemies shared grief, Anna's vibrating typewriter, Wilson's stiff pen stroke, the weighted carnation code, the heavy ritual of handwritten letters, and now this, a greenhouse where love is cultivated on schedule, where affection is graded, packaged, and prepared for delivery. The transition isn't jarring. It's gradual, inevitable, like water finding its own level. You probably wouldn't survive a morning of 1920s floral logistics without at least one muddy boot, a slightly crooked ribbon, and a firm belief that flowers were never meant to be graded like produce. A worker catches your eye and offers a small, perfectly formed white carnation, its petals crisp and unblemished, its stem trimmed and sealed with a drop of wax. You take it, feeling the cool weight of the bloom against your palm, and notice how the greenhouse light catches the delicate edges of the petals, making them seem almost luminous. The gesture is simple, almost mundane, but it carries the heavy gravity of 1,000 unspoken acknowledgements. The knowledge that this flower will travel, will be pinned, will be remembered. You slip it into your coat pocket, where it rests against the lining like a quiet promise, its sweet fragrance slowly weaving itself into the fabric. You probably wouldn't survive a century of floral commercialization without at least one overpriced bouquet, a slightly wilted corsage, and a deep appreciation for the friends who still pick wildflowers just because. Yet here, in the damp, echoing aisles of the greenhouse, the systematization of sentiment feels less like a betrayal and more like an evolution, a way for a personal gesture to scale, to reach more people, to become a shared ritual that transcends individual households. As the morning light strengthens, filtering through the fogged glass panels in soft, diffused beams, the greenhouse hums with a quiet energy that feels both heavy and light, heavy with the responsibility of meeting demand, light with the satisfaction of a job well done. You watch as crates are loaded onto a waiting truck, the wooden slats creaking softly under the weight of wrapped blooms, and you feel the vibration of departure, of movement, of tradition travelling outward from this humid, glass-walled space to touch homes and hearts across the country. You think about how Anna Jarvis, who once distributed 500 white carnations from a small church in West Virginia, might react to this scene. The careful grading, the shipping logistics, the profit margins. Would she see it as a betrayal of her vision or as a testament to its reach? You probably wouldn't survive the emotional complexity of that question without at least one good cry in the potting shed, a very long walk in the rain, and a deep appreciation for the friends who remind you that traditions, like flowers, are meant to grow, to change, to adapt. Yet here, in the heavy humidity of the 1920s greenhouse, you feel a sense of continuity, a vibrating thread that connects the personal to the commercial, the grassroots to the industrial, the quiet act of picking a flower to the loud machinery of mass distribution. You adjust your collar, feeling the damp air settle into your lungs, and prepare to follow the trail of wrapped crates and shipping manifests toward the next quiet evolution of this tradition, where industrial presses and pre-written words will soon take over the work that flowers and ink began. You take one last look at the greenhouse, at the rows of carnations standing straight and proud, at the workers moving with quiet efficiency, and you feel the quiet certainty that this isn't an ending. It's a threshold. You probably wouldn't survive the next phase of cultural evolution without at least one ironic comment about greeting cards, a sudden craving for flowers that aren't on sale, and a firm belief that the best traditions are the ones we keep reimagining. Yet for now, in this heavy, humid, vibrating moment, you let the systematization of sentiment settle into your bones, and you prepare to walk forward, carrying with you the toxic sweet truth that sometimes the most enduring gestures are the ones that learn to wear a price tag, not because they've lost their meaning, but because they've found a way to reach more hands, more hearts, more homes. You witness the stiff clatter before you even see the machines, a rhythmic, percussive thunder that seems to shake the very floorboards beneath your feet, turning sentiment into product, affection into inventory. The air in this 1920s printing plant is thick with the scent of ink, oil, and freshly cut paper, a combination that's both industrial and oddly comforting, like the smell of a well-used workshop. You step carefully around stacks of cardboard sheets, their edges sharp and precise, their surfaces waiting to be transformed into vessels for words you didn't write, sentiments you didn't craft, emotions you're being asked to borrow. You probably wouldn't survive an afternoon on a 1920s factory floor without at least one ink-stained fingerprint that won't wash off, a sudden craving for earplugs that haven't been invented yet, and a deep appreciation for the invention of noise-cancelling headphones. Yet here, Beneath the vaulted ceiling where belts whir and gears grind, the vibrating intimacy Anna Jarvis envisioned is being gently, systematically diluted into something that can be mass-produced, packaged and sold with a polite smile. Mainstream historical records confirm that by the mid-1920s, greeting card companies like Hallmark had begun to capitalize on Mother's Day, with specially designed cards featuring pre-written verses, embossed flowers, and delicate lace patterns that could be produced by the thousands on industrial presses. It wasn't just stationery anymore, it was sentiment systematized, weighted with the knowledge that a well-chosen card could save time, reduce anxiety, and ensure that no mother went unhonored on her designated day. You watch as a massive press stamps out row after row of identical cards, each one featuring a soft focus illustration of a mother and child, a verse in elegant script, and a blank space at the bottom for a signature that feels almost like an afterthought. The process is mesmerizing in its efficiency, vibrating with the quiet power of industrialization, but you can't help noticing how the words on the cards, though beautifully printed, feel slightly generic, slightly distant, like they were written for everyone, and therefore for no one in particular. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional labor of selecting a pre-written sentiment that perfectly captures your feelings, without at least one awkward moment of recognition that the card says it better than you ever could, and a firm belief that vulnerability was invented by someone who never had to shop for greeting cards under fluorescent lights. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in early advertising archives that always makes modern marketers smirk. Some card companies experimented with personalization inserts, small, pre-printed slips of paper with phrases like, "with love from your devoted son," or "from your grateful daughter," that could be glued inside the card to simulate a handwritten touch without requiring actual handwriting. Imagine trying to maintain the illusion of personal affection while your fingers are slightly sticky from adhesive and you're carefully aligning a tiny slip of paper that says "devoted," even though you forgot to call last Tuesday. It's the 1920s equivalent of adding a custom emoji to a group chat and hoping no one notices you copied it from a meme. You notice a stack of these inserts near a workbench, their edges slightly curled from humidity, and wonder how many mothers received cards that felt just a little too perfect, just a little too polished, to be entirely authentic. It's a reminder that sometimes the most well-intentioned shortcuts can create a subtle distance between gesture and genuineness, between convenience and connection. Historians still argue whether the rise of mass-produced Mother's Day greeting cards was primarily a democratizing force that made the tradition accessible to people who struggled with writing or time, or a subtle erosion of the personal, handwritten intimacy that Anna Jarvis believed was essential to the holiday's meaning. You lean against a sturdy workbench, feeling the cool metal against your palm as you watch workers carefully collate, fold, and package the finished cards into neat bundles ready for distribution. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the experience. The way a pre-written verse can sometimes give voice to feelings we struggle to articulate, or how the convenience of a card can ensure that love is expressed even when words fail. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes how even the most heartfelt traditions can brush against the machinery of convenience, how the deeply personal can slowly learn to wear a barcode. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of balancing authenticity with accessibility without at least one good cry over a beautifully printed card that still felt slightly hollow, a very long walk to clear your head, and a deep appreciation for the friends who still write their own messages in the blank space at the bottom. The clatter of the presses grows louder as you move deeper into the plant, and the air vibrates with the rhythmic stamp of metal on paper, a sound that's both mechanical and strangely musical, like a heartbeat translated into industry. Workers move with a quiet efficiency that feels almost hypnotic, feeding sheets into the press, removing finished cards, checking for smudges or misalignments with a quick, practiced eye. You notice how the cards themselves seem to multiply before your eyes, one becoming 10, 10 becoming 100, 100 becoming a stack that reaches toward the ceiling, each one carrying the same verse, the same illustration, the same promise of affection. It's a paradox that fits the era perfectly. A tradition that honors the unique, irreplaceable bond between mother and child, now being expressed through identical pieces of cardboard produced by the thousands. You think about the Phrygian smoke that once carried prayers up mountain slopes, the Roman petals tossed into parades, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the neutral tea tables where former enemies shared grief, Anna's vibrating typewriter, Wilson's stiff pen stroke, the weighted carnation code, the heavy ritual of handwritten letters, the humid greenhouses where love was cultivated on schedule. And now this, a factory where sentiment is stamped out by the pound, where affection is packaged, priced, and prepared for delivery. The transition isn't jarring. It's gradual, inevitable, like water finding its own level. You probably wouldn't survive a morning of 1920s card production without at least one paper cut, a slightly smudged verse, and a firm belief that perfection was invented by someone who never actually had to meet a deadline. A worker catches your eye and offers a freshly printed card, its surface still warm from the press, its ink slightly raised under your fingertips. You take it, feeling the stiff weight of the cardboard, the smooth glide of the embossed flowers, and you notice how the pre-written verse, though beautifully composed, feels slightly distant, slightly generic, like it was written for a mother in general rather than your mother in particular. You turn it over, looking at the blank space at the bottom where a signature is expected, and you feel the heavy responsibility of adding your own words to a sentiment that's already been spoken for you. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional complexity of personalizing a mass-produced card without at least one nervous hesitation, a slightly shaky signature, and a deep appreciation for the invention of the PS, that humble addendum that often carries the most genuine affection. Yet here, in the stiff, clattering heart of the printing plant, the cardboard flood feels less like a betrayal and more like an evolution, a way for a personal gesture to scale, to reach more people, to become a shared ritual that transcends individual households, even if it comes at the cost of some vibrating intimacy. As the afternoon light filters through the high windows, casting long, angular shadows across the factory floor, the plant hums with a quiet energy that feels both heavy and light, heavy with the responsibility of meeting demand, light with the satisfaction of a job well done. You watch as bundles of cards are loaded onto waiting trucks, the cardboard crates creaking softly under the weight of packaged sentiment, and you feel the vibration of departure, of movement, of tradition traveling outward from this industrial space to touch homes and hearts across the country. You think about how Anna Jarvis, who once envisioned a day of handwritten letters and personal gestures, might react to this scene, the mass production, the pre-written verses, the profit margins. Would she see it as a betrayal of her vision or as a testament to its reach? You probably wouldn't survive the emotional complexity of that question without at least one good cry in the break room, a very long walk in the rain, and a deep appreciation for the friends who remind you that traditions, like words, are meant to grow, to change, to adapt. Yet here, in the stiff clatter of the 1920s printing plant, you feel a sense of continuity, a vibrating thread that connects the personal to the commercial, the handwritten to the mass-produced, the quiet act of writing a letter to the loud machinery of industrial presses. You adjust your collar, feeling the ink-scented air settle into your lungs, and prepare to follow the trail of packaged cards and shipping manifests toward the next quiet evolution of this tradition, where the paradox of a childless architect will soon take center stage. You take one last look at the printing plant, at the rows of finished cards standing ready for distribution, at the workers moving with quiet efficiency, and you feel the quiet certainty that this isn't an ending. It's a threshold. You probably wouldn't survive the next phase of cultural evolution without at least one ironic comment about Hallmark holidays, a sudden craving for stationery that isn't on sale, and a firm belief that the best traditions are the ones we keep reimagining. Yet for now, in this stiff, clattering, vibrating moment, you let the cardboard flood settle into your bones, and you prepare to walk forward, carrying with you the weighted truth that sometimes the most enduring gestures are the ones that learn to wear a price tag. Not because they've lost their meaning, but because they've found a way to reach more hands, more hearts, More homes, even if the words on the page weren't written by your own hand. You experience the heavy paradox before you even see her face. A quiet tension in the air that feels both reverent and slightly bewildered, like walking into a room where everyone is celebrating a holiday you helped create but never personally observed. The year is the late 1920s, and Anna Jarvis sits in a modest Philadelphia apartment that feels both too large and too small for the weight of her legacy. The furniture is simple, the curtains drawn just enough to soften the afternoon light, and the only decoration is a framed photograph of her mother, Anne Reeves Jarvis, looking gentle but resolute on a side table. You settle into a chair that creaks softly under your weight, feeling the familiar resistance of wood that has supported decades of quiet contemplation, and you watch as Anna moves through the room with a stiff, deliberate grace that seems to carry the entire history of Mother's Day in the set of her shoulders. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional complexity of being the architect of a global celebration you never personally participated in without at least one existential crisis over brunch invitations, a sudden craving for solitude that isn't available in a world that keeps sending you flowers, and a deep appreciation for the invention of the Do Not Disturb sign. Yet here in this quiet space, the paradox of Anna Jarvis, the childless guardian of a domestic ritual celebrated by millions, unfolds with a vibrating intensity that feels both heavy and light, both personal and profoundly public. Mainstream historical records confirm that Anna Jarvis never married and never had children, a fact that she addressed with characteristic directness when questioned about her role as the founder of Mother's Day. A mother, she would say, is the person who has done more for you than anyone in the world, and for Anna, that definition extended beyond biology to encompass the universal experience of maternal care, sacrifice, and love. You watch as she carefully arranges a small bouquet of white carnations on the table, her movements precise, almost ceremonial, and you feel the weight of that gesture. The knowledge that she is honoring not just her own mother, but the very idea of motherhood itself, a concept she championed with a stiff, unwavering conviction that sometimes bordered on the prickly. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of defending your life's work against accusations of hypocrisy without at least one dramatic sigh, a carefully worded letter to the editor that takes 3 drafts to get right, and a firm belief that nuance was invented by someone who really liked to complicate simple questions. Yet here, in this quiet apartment, Anna's paradox feels less like a contradiction and more like a testament to the power of love that chooses, that commits, that honors without requiring biological ties to validate its authenticity. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in Anna's personal correspondence that always makes modern biographers smile. Some letters suggest she kept a small locked drawer filled with unsent Mother's Day cards she received over the years, each one carefully annotated with marginal notes like "too commercial," "missing the point," or "but the sentiment is genuine." Imagine trying to curate a collection of greetings that simultaneously honor your vision and disappoint your standards, all while maintaining a polite public face. It's the early 20th century equivalent of reading your own Yelp reviews, while pretending you don't have a spreadsheet tracking them. You notice a faint impression on the desk where the drawer sits, a subtle indentation in the wood that speaks to years of opening, closing, contemplating, and you wonder how many of those cards Anna reread on quiet evenings, weighing the vibrating intimacy of a handwritten note against the weighted convenience of a pre-printed verse. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound guardianship comes with a side of gentle exasperation, that loving a tradition doesn't mean you have to love every expression of it. Historians still argue whether Anna Jarvis's childless status ultimately strengthened her authority as the founder of Mother's Day, allowing her to champion a universal, inclusive vision of maternal honor, or if it subtly complicated her relationship with the holiday, as it evolved into a more domestic, family-centered celebration. You lean back in your creaking chair, watching the afternoon light catch the dust motes dancing above the desk, and ponder the question, maybe the distinction isn't as important as the outcome. The way Anna's personal story became a quiet invitation for anyone who has ever received or given maternal care to see themselves in the tradition, regardless of biology. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes how even the most personal legacies can brush against the complexities of human experience, how the deeply individual can slowly learn to wear a universal label. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of navigating public perception without at least one good cry over a misunderstood interview, a very long walk to clear your head, and a deep appreciation for the friends who remind you that your story doesn't have to look like everyone else's to be valid. The air in the apartment grows quieter as the afternoon deepens, and you notice how Anna's movements slow, becoming more deliberate, more contemplative. She picks up a pen, dips it into an inkwell, and begins to write, not a letter to a politician or a newspaper editor, but a simple note to a young woman who had written to ask for advice on honoring her own mother. The ink flows smoothly across the page, and you can almost feel the vibration of Anna's conviction in every stroke, the heavy certainty that even a small gesture, when offered with sincerity, can carry the weight of a tradition. You think about the Phrygian smoke that once carried prayers up mountain slopes, the Roman petals tossed into parades, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the neutral tea tables where former enemies shared grief, Anna's vibrating typewriter, Wilson's stiff pen stroke, the weighted carnation code, the heavy ritual of handwritten letters, the humid greenhouses where love was cultivated on schedule, the cardboard flood of mass-produced sentiment, and now this, a quiet apartment where a childless woman writes a personal note that carries the entire history of Mother's Day in its ink. The transition isn't jarring, it's gradual, inevitable, like water finding its own level. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of holding both vision and reality without at least one good cry over a perfectly good idea that got slightly lost in translation, a very long walk in the rain, and a firm belief that the best traditions are the ones that leave room for reinterpretation. Anna finishes her note, blots the ink carefully, and folds the page with deliberate precision, tucking it into an envelope that she addresses in her neatest hand. The process feels almost ceremonial, each step weighted with the knowledge that this small packet of paper will carry her voice across miles, across time, to land in the hands of someone who is trying, in their own way, to honor the nurturing forces in their life. You watch as she seals the envelope with a dab of wax, pressing her thumb into the soft surface to leave a faint, personal mark, not a signature, exactly, but a trace. A quiet assertion of presence. It's a gesture that feels both heavy and light, heavy with the responsibility of having spoken her truth, light with the relief of having set it free. You probably wouldn't survive the anticipation of waiting for a reply without at least one nervous glance out the window, a sudden craving for cookies to soothe the suspense, and a deep appreciation for the invention of read receipts, even if they do sometimes cause more anxiety than they relieve. As the lamp begins to gutter, casting long dancing shadows across the apartment, Anna stands, feeling the pleasant ache in her fingers from writing, the slight stiffness in her shoulders from leaning over the desk. She takes one last look at the scene, the inkwell, the blotting paper, the pile of letters waiting to travel, the quiet satisfaction on her face. The air still carries the faint scent of ink and beeswax, a combination that feels both old-fashioned and deeply human. You think about how this stiff, heavy, vibrating ritual of personal correspondence will soon be altered by the rise of commercial greeting cards, by industrial presses and pre-written sentiments, by the convenience that often comes at the cost of intimacy. But for now, in this lamplit apartment, the handwritten note still holds its ground, a quiet testament to the power of slowing down, of choosing words with care, of letting ink carry affection in a way that no algorithm can fully replicate. You adjust your collar, feel the cool night air seep in through the window, and prepare to step into the next chapter of this long, winding story, where the bitter ending and the eternal return will soon take center stage. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional complexity of Anna's paradox without at least one good cry over the gap between vision and reality. A very long walk to clear your head, and a deep appreciation for the friends who remind you that legacy isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. Yet here, in the quiet apartment of a childless architect, you feel a sense of continuity, a vibrating thread that connects the personal to the universal, the biological to the chosen, the stiff guardian to the weighted ritual celebrated by millions. You take one last look at Anna, at the photograph of her mother, at the small bouquet of white carnations on the table, and you feel the quiet certainty that this isn't an ending, it's a threshold. You probably wouldn't survive the next phase of cultural evolution without at least one ironic comment about the commercialization of love, a sudden craving for flowers that aren't on sale, and a firm belief that the best traditions are the ones we keep reimagining. Yet for now, in this heavy, stiff, vibrating moment, you let the paradox of the childless architect settle into your bones, and you prepare to walk forward, carrying with you the weighted truth that sometimes the most enduring legacies are built not by those who fit the mold, but by those who dare to redefine it. You trudge through the stiff corridors of a 1940s Pennsylvania's asylum, where the linoleum floors reflect the pale, flickering light of overhead fixtures, and the air smells faintly of antiseptic, old wool, and damp plaster. The heavy quiet here isn't empty. It's layered with the muffled footsteps of nurses, the distant hum of a cast-iron radiator, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of residents who have long since made peace with being forgotten. You're walking toward the end of a story that began with vibrating typewriters, 500 white carnations, and a daughter's unshakable vow, and it leads here to a room with peeling paint, a narrow cot, and a single frosted window overlooking a courtyard of bare winter trees. Anna Jarvis sits in a high-backed wooden chair by the heat vent, her posture still carrying that familiar, unwavering rigidity. Though her body is frail, her eyes clouded by cataracts, her pockets empty of everything but decades-old receipts and fading correspondence. You probably wouldn't survive a week in a mid-century sanitarium without at least one dramatic complaint about the tapioca pudding, a misplaced house shoe, and a sudden, profound appreciation for modern healthcare, privacy regulations, and reasonably padded mattresses. Yet here, in this heavy quiet, the architect of Mother's Day is fading, and her life's work feels increasingly toxic and undone. Mainstream historical records confirm that by the early 1940s, Anna had spent nearly every dollar she possessed, and then some, fighting commercialization through lawsuits, public boycotts, and relentless letter-writing campaigns. She famously refused to trademark her own holiday, believing it belonged to the public, yet when florists, confectioners, and card companies turned it into a seasonal profit engine, she fought back with every legal and rhetorical tool available. She refunded donations, returned gifts, and eventually depleted her savings, forcing her into the Marshall Square Sanitarium in Westchester, Pennsylvania, where she would remain until her death in 1948. You pull up a straight-backed chair beside her, feeling the stiff groan of the legs against the worn floorboards, and notice how her hands rest folded in her lap, fingers tracing invisible patterns as if still drafting injunctions in her mind. The heavy quiet of the ward wraps around you like a thick wool blanket, dense with the unspoken realization that the very tradition she nurtured has outgrown her, twisted into something she no longer recognizes. You watch her turn her head slightly toward the window, as if listening to the wind move through the courtyard branches, and you feel the toxic weight of her disillusionment, a bitter, lingering aftertaste of a dream that was packaged, priced, and sold back to the public in pastel wrappers. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional labor of watching your greatest cultural contribution get repurposed into a clearance rack obligation without at least one dramatic sigh into a paper cup, a strong opinion about branded merchandise, and a firm belief that capitalism has a sense of humor you simply don't appreciate. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in old sanitarium intake logs and visitor correspondence that always makes modern archivists pause. Some accounts suggest Anna kept a meticulous, handwritten ledger of every commercial Mother's Day greeting card, floral arrangement, and restaurant special she encountered, rating them on a scale of acceptable sentiment to atrocious exploitation, and occasionally mailing annotated copies back to publishers with polite but deeply pointed marginalia. Imagine trying to run a grassroots anti-commercialization campaign from a sanitarium room, armed with nothing but a fountain pen, a stack of index cards, and the sheer, stubborn conviction that love shouldn't come with a wholesale discount code. It's the 1940s equivalent of leaving one-star reviews on products you literally helped invent, and you have to admire the uncompromising dedication. You notice a small cloth-bound notebook resting on her bedside table, its cover worn smooth from years of handling, and you wonder how many late-night hours she spent cross-referencing profit margins with poetic verses, trying to quantify the exact moment a gesture of gratitude crossed into transactional routine. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound guardianship comes with a ledger, and that idealism doesn't always retire when the body does. Historians still argue whether Anna Jarvis's descent into isolation and financial ruin was primarily the inevitable result of an uncompromising moral vision colliding with the machinery of American consumer culture, or if it was significantly accelerated by her deteriorating health, mounting medical debts, and the psychological toll of fighting a cultural war she was always destined to lose. You lean back in your stiff chair, listening to the heavy rhythm of her breathing, and ponder the question in the quiet dimness of the room. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the tragedy itself. The way a woman who once channeled private grief into a national holiday of personal connection ended up watching it become a calendar event driven by sales targets, marketing campaigns, and obligatory brunch reservations. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes how even the most carefully guarded ideals can feel toxic when they're stretched beyond their original shape. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of defending a principle that the world has already repurposed without at least one good cry into a pillowcase, a very long walk in the snow, and a deep appreciation for the friends who remind you that legacy isn't about control, it's about release. The afternoon light begins to soften, casting long, pale shadows across the linoleum and warming the stiff metal of the radiator just slightly. Anna doesn't speak. She rarely does anymore, but her presence carries the heavy resonance of a story that refuses to be neatly wrapped in a bow. You think about the Phrygian drums that vibrated through mountain stone, the Roman petals tossed into parades, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the neutral tea tables where former enemies shared grief, Anna's vibrating typewriter, Wilson's stiff pen stroke, the weighted carnation code, the heavy ritual of handwritten letters, the humid greenhouses where love was cultivated on schedule, the cardboard flood of mass-produced sentiment, the paradox of the childless architect, and now this, a quiet asylum room where the founder of a global holiday fades into the heavy quiet, her life's work feeling toxic and undone. The transition isn't jarring, it's gradual, inevitable, like a tide pulling back to reveal the shore it once covered. You probably wouldn't survive the weight of watching history outlive its author, without at least one sudden urge to draft a strongly worded letter, a misplaced bookmark, and a firm belief that time is just a very patient editor. You adjust your posture, feeling the stiff wood of the chair press against your spine, and let the heavy quiet of the ward settle into your bones. Anna's hands are still now, resting peacefully in her lap, the invisible patterns she once traced giving way to something softer, something that feels less like resistance and more like surrender. The air carries a faint scent of lavender and old paper, a combination that feels both medicinal and deeply human, a quiet bridge between the clinical and the sacred. You think about how her toxic disillusionment wasn't born of malice, but of a profound, almost unbearable love for a vision she feared was being erased. Yet here, in this stiff corridor, in this heavy quiet, you feel the quiet certainty that endings are rarely final. Traditions breathe, they shift, they outgrow their creators, and sometimes the very act of letting go is what allows them to survive. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional complexity of a legacy you can't control without at least one good sigh, a sudden craving for strong tea, and a deep appreciation for the people who keep writing their own letters anyway. You stand slowly, brushing a faint layer of dust from your coat, and take one last look at the room, at the narrow window, at the woman who gave the world a day and asked for nothing in return but sincerity. You feel ready for whatever comes next, carrying with you the heavy truth that sometimes the most enduring stories are the ones that don't get to end on their own terms. You step back into the stiff corridor, let the heavy quiet wrap around your shoulders, and prepare to walk toward the next chapter, where secret benefactors, ironic twists, and a vibrating fate will soon reveal that even in the quietest endings, the story never really stops. You witness the weighted irony before you even see the paperwork, a quiet, almost theatrical twist of fate that feels like the universe itself has a sense of humor you're not entirely sure you appreciate. The year is 1947, and Anna Jarvis still resides in the Marshall Square Sanitarium, her body frail, her eyes clouded, her spirit worn thin by decades of fighting a cultural war that slipped quietly out of her hands. But now, something unexpected is happening behind the scenes, something vibrating with contradiction. Anonymous payments begin arriving at the sanitarium's administrative office, covering her medical bills, her modest personal expenses, the small comforts that make institutional life slightly more bearable. No name is attached, no note is included, just checks, money orders, and the occasional envelope of cash, all marked for the care of Anna Jarvis. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional complexity of receiving anonymous charity from the very industry you spent your life suing without at least one dramatic pause, a muttered comment about poetic justice, and a deep appreciation for the invention of the anonymous donation drop box. Yet here, in the stiff corridors of a Pennsylvania asylum, the floral industry she fought so fiercely is quietly, anonymously keeping her alive. Mainstream historical records confirm that in the final years of Anna Jarvis's life, members of the floral trade, florists, greenhouse operators, and industry associations she had publicly criticized, sued, and boycotted, began contributing anonymously to a fund that covered her medical and living expenses. They never sought credit. They never issued press releases. They simply ensured that the woman who once distributed 500 white carnations from a small West Virginia church would not spend her final days in destitution. You watch as a sanitarium administrator opens an envelope at a modest wooden desk, examines the check inside, and files it quietly into a ledger marked Special Accounts. The gesture is simple, almost mundane, but it carries the heavy weight of a paradox. The very people Anna accused of commercializing her vision were now ensuring her basic dignity. You probably wouldn't survive the moral ambiguity of accepting help from your perceived adversaries without at least one internal debate about principle versus pragmatism, a slightly awkward thank you note that you never send, and a firm belief that karma has a very specific sense of timing. Yet here, in the heavy quiet of the sanitarium office, the weighted irony unfolds with a vibrating subtlety that feels both stiff and strangely tender. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in old floral trade newsletters and sanitarium financial logs that always makes modern researchers smile. Some accounts suggest the anonymous contributions were coordinated through a rotating network of regional florist associations, with each group taking turns sending payments under different pseudonyms. Sometimes a friend of mother's, sometimes the Carnation Society, once even from the Garden of Gratitude. Imagine trying to organize a secret charity campaign while maintaining plausible deniability and avoiding any hint of public relations opportunism. It's the 1940s equivalent of running a covert Slack channel for good deeds, and you have to admire the logistical finesse. You notice a small stack of envelopes on the administrator's desk, each bearing a different return address, each postmarked from a different city. And you wonder how many florists across the country paused in their greenhouses or shops to contribute a few dollars to a cause they publicly disagreed with, but privately respected. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of reconciliation happen not in courtrooms or press conferences, but in quiet offices, with unsigned checks and unspoken acknowledgements. Historians still argue whether the floral industry's anonymous support for Anna Jarvis was primarily a genuine gesture of respect for her original vision, a subtle attempt to soften her public criticism, or a pragmatic effort to ensure that the founder of Mother's Day didn't die in poverty, a narrative that could have damaged the holiday's cultural standing. You lean against the administrator's desk, feeling the cool wood against your palm as you watch the quiet bureaucracy of compassion unfold. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the outcome. The way a woman who once felt toxic and undone by the commercialization of her life's work was quietly, anonymously, cared for by the very system she opposed. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes how even the stiffest contradictions can carry a note of grace. how heavy irony can sometimes soften into something resembling forgiveness. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of navigating moral ambiguity without at least one good cry over the gap between principle and practice, a very long walk in the rain, and a deep appreciation for the friends who remind you that people are rarely all good or all bad. The afternoon light filters through the sanitarium's high windows, casting long, pale shadows across the linoleum and warming the stiff metal of the radiator just slightly. You think about Anna, sitting in her room down the hall, unaware of the anonymous checks arriving in her name, or perhaps aware but choosing not to acknowledge them. You wonder how she would react if she knew that the floral industry she sued, the card companies she boycotted, the restaurateurs she criticized for turning Mother's Day into a brunch obligation, were now ensuring she had clean linens, warm meals, and the modest comforts of institutional care. Would she see it as a betrayal of her principles, or as a quiet testament to the enduring power of the tradition she created? You probably wouldn't survive the emotional complexity of that question without at least one dramatic sigh into a paper cup, a misplaced bookmark, and a firm belief that nuance was invented by someone who really liked to complicate simple answers. Yet here, in the heavy quiet of the sanitarium, the vibrating twist of fate unfolds with a stiff contradiction that feels both painful and strangely beautiful. You step back into the corridor, feeling the stiff linoleum beneath your boots, and let the weighted irony settle into your bones. The air carries a faint scent of antiseptic and old paper, a combination that feels both clinical and deeply human, a quiet bridge between the administrative and the sacred. You think about how Anna's life ended not with a grand reconciliation or a public apology, but with a series of anonymous checks, quiet payments, and unspoken acknowledgements that carried more weight than any press release ever could. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of care happen in the shadows, that gratitude doesn't always need a spotlight to be genuine, and that even the stiffest contradictions can vibrate with a quiet, persistent humanity. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of holding both resentment and grace without at least one good cry over a perfectly good principle that got slightly lost in translation, a very long walk in the snow, and a firm belief that the best traditions are the ones that leave room for reinterpretation. As the light begins to soften, casting long, dancing shadows across the corridor, you take a slow breath and prepare to follow the trail of anonymous payments and quiet gestures toward the next chapter of this long, winding story. You think about how the floral industry's secret benefaction echoes in modern traditions of anonymous giving, of quiet support that asks for nothing in return but the satisfaction of doing what's right. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional complexity of a legacy you can't control without at least one sudden urge to draft a strongly worded letter, a misplaced house shoe, and a deep appreciation for the people who keep writing their own letters anyway. Yet here, in the stiff, heavy, vibrating moment of anonymous charity, you feel a sense of continuity, a thread that connects the personal to the universal, the bitter to the sweet, the stiff guardian to the weighted ritual celebrated by millions. You adjust your collar, feel the cool air of the corridor settle into your lungs, and prepare to step into the next chapter, where the global ripple of Mother's Day will soon take center stage, blooming in heavy variation across world calendars, cultural traditions, and the quiet, vibrating truth that motherhood, in all its forms, deserves to be honored. You take one last look at the administrator's desk, at the stack of anonymous envelopes, at the quiet bureaucracy of compassion, and you feel the quiet certainty that this isn't an ending. It's a threshold. You probably wouldn't survive the next phase of cultural evolution without at least one ironic comment about the commercialization of love, a sudden craving for flowers that aren't on sale, and a firm belief that the best traditions are the ones we keep reimagining. Yet for now, in this weighted, vibrating, stiff moment of secret benefaction, you let the irony settle into your bones, and you prepare to walk forward, carrying with you the heavy truth that sometimes the most enduring legacies are built not by those who fit the mold, but by those who dare to redefine it, even if the redefinition comes with a side of quiet, anonymous checks. You trudge through world calendars where time itself seems to bloom in heavy variation, each culture weaving its own thread into the tapestry of maternal honor. The air shifts with every border you cross, first carrying the jasmine-scented humidity of Bangkok, then the highland chill of Addis Ababa, then the damp, green breath of an English spring, and you realize that Mother's Day isn't a single date on a global ledger, but a vibrating constellation of traditions, each weighted with its own history, its own symbols, its own quiet insistence that nurturing deserves to be remembered. You probably wouldn't survive an afternoon of international holiday research without at least one confused glance at a time zone converter, a sudden craving for snacks that span 3 continents, and a deep appreciation for the invention of the universal maybe emoji. Yet here, in the stiff architecture of world calendars, you feel the heavy pull of a truth that transcends borders. Motherhood, in all its forms, finds a way to be honoured however the local sun rises. You start in Thailand, where August 12 isn't just a date. It's a national tribute to Queen Sirikit, whose birthday was designated Mother's Day in 1976 to honour her role as a maternal figure to the nation. The air here is thick with the scent of jasmine garlands and temple incense, and you watch as families gather in public squares to present their mothers with gifts of fragrant flowers, small tokens of gratitude, and the traditional white jasmine blossom that symbolizes purity and enduring love. Mainstream historical records confirm that Thailand's Mother's Day blends ancient Buddhist reverence for maternal compassion with modern nationalist sentiment, creating a celebration that feels both deeply personal and broadly civic. You notice how the jasmine blossoms are carefully woven into intricate patterns, their delicate petals heavy with meaning, their fragrance vibrating through the warm evening air like a quiet hymn. You probably wouldn't survive a Thai Mother's Day ceremony without at least one awkward bow, a misplaced compliment about someone's garland weaving skills, and a firm belief that humidity was invented by someone who really liked to complicate hair maintenance. Yet here, beneath the golden spires of a Bangkok temple, the weighted tradition unfolds with a stiff grace that feels both ancient and refreshingly contemporary. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in Thai cultural archives that always makes modern anthropologists smile. Some regional communities practice a gentle ritual called Rod Nam Dam Hua, where younger family members pour scented water over the hands of their elders as a sign of respect. A gesture that's sometimes incorporated into Mother's Day observances as a way to honour not just biological mothers, but all the maternal figures who've guided a person's life. Imagine trying to coordinate a water-pouring ceremony while wearing your finest silk outfit and hoping no one spills tea on the ceremonial bowl. It's the Southeast Asian equivalent of a group hug with extra steps, and you have to admire the elegant symbolism. You watch as a young woman carefully lifts a silver pitcher, tilting it just so to let a thin stream of jasmine-scented water flow over her grandmother's hands. And you feel the heavy resonance of a gesture that carries centuries of filial piety in its simple motion. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound honours are also sort of the most tactile, that love doesn't always need words to be deeply felt. Historians still argue whether Thailand's choice to anchor Mother's Day to Queen Sirikit's birthday was primarily a strategic effort to strengthen national unity through royal symbolism, or a genuine cultural evolution that allowed ancient Buddhist values of maternal compassion to find new expression in a modern civic framework. You lean against a temple pillar, feeling the cool stone against your palm, as you watch families gather for evening prayers, their jasmine garlands glowing softly in the lantern light. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the outcome. The way a national holiday can become a vessel for both personal gratitude and collective identity, allowing individuals to honour their own mothers while participating in a broader cultural ritual. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, with the one that recognises how even the stiffest traditions can soften into something deeply personal when they're lived, not just observed. You leave the jasmine-scented air of Thailand behind and feel the ground shift beneath your feet, the humid warmth giving way to the crisp, highland chill of Ethiopia, where Mother's Day isn't a fixed date on the Gregorian calendar but a vibrant, moving feast tied to the end of the rainy season. This is Antrosh, a celebration that pulses with heavy variation from region to region, but always centres on family gatherings, traditional songs, and a communal meal that feels both festive and deeply reverent. You trudge through a village courtyard where women in colourful shawls prepare injera and wat, their hands moving with a vibrating efficiency that speaks to generations of practice, while children dart between legs, their laughter ringing clear against the backdrop of drumming and song. Mainstream historical records confirm that Antrost is a multi-day celebration where families honour maternal ancestors through storytelling, food sharing, and ritual dances that connect the living to the lineage of care that came before. You probably wouldn't survive an Antrost feast without at least one enthusiastic serving of spicy wat, a sudden craving for water that isn't infused with berbe, and a deep appreciation for the invention of the universal "I'm full, thank you" hand gesture. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in Ethiopian oral histories that always makes modern ethnomusicologists pause. Some communities incorporate a playful ritual where children present their mothers with small, hand-carved tokens, often animals or symbols of protection, and then perform improvised songs that blend traditional lyrics with personal jokes or family anecdotes. Imagine trying to compose a heartfelt tribute on the spot, while your little brother is doing an impression of the family goat in the background. It's the East African equivalent of a roast that's also a love letter, and you have to admire the emotional agility. You notice a young girl carefully placing a tiny wooden bird into her mother's palm, her eyes sparkling with mischief and affection, and you feel the heavy weight of a gesture that carries both humour and reverence in equal measure. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound honours are the most playful, that love doesn't always need solemnity to be deeply meaningful. You step from the highland warmth of Ethiopia into the damp green breath of an English spring, where Mothering Sunday still echoes with the stiff lanes of the 16th century, but now blends with modern traditions in a way that feels both familiar and subtly transformed. The air here carries the scent of wet earth, blooming daffodils, and the faint, comforting aroma of simnel cake baking in neighbourhood ovens. You trudge through a village churchyard where families gather after service, their posies of wildflowers slightly wilted from the morning's walk, but no less cherished, and you notice how the tradition has evolved to include not just visits to the mother church, but also small gifts, handwritten notes, and the occasional awkward family brunch. Mainstream historical records confirm that the UK's Mothering Sunday, rooted in the Lenten tradition of returning to one's parish church, has gradually absorbed elements of the American Mother's Day, while retaining its distinct ecclesiastical character. A blend that feels both heavy with history and light with contemporary adaptation. You probably wouldn't survive an English Mothering Sunday without at least one sudden downpour, a misplaced umbrella, and a firm belief that the weather was invented by someone who really liked to keep everyone guessing. Historians still argue whether the global variation of Mother's Day traditions represents a healthy cultural diversification of a shared human impulse, or a subtle fragmentation that dilutes the original vision of a unified, intentional day of maternal honour. You lean against a stone wall in the English churchyard, watching families exchange posies and quiet words, and ponder the question in the soft afternoon light. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the common thread. The way cultures across the world, however differently they calendarize it, however uniquely they ritualize it, still pause to acknowledge the nurturing forces that shape their lives. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes how even the stiffest traditions can bloom in heavy variation when they're carried across borders, adapted to local soils, and allowed to grow in their own time. As the light begins to soften, casting long shadows across the village green, you take a slow breath and let the global ripple of Mother's Day settle into your bones. You think about how the jasmine garlands of Thailand, the Antrost feasts of Ethiopia, and the wildflower posies of England all carry the same vibrating truth, that motherhood in all its forms deserves to be honoured however the local sun rises. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of navigating cultural variation without at least one good cry over a misunderstood tradition, a very long walk in the rain, and a deep appreciation for the friends who remind you that love doesn't need a universal date to be genuine. Yet here, in the stiff architecture of world calendars, you feel a sense of continuity, a thread that connects the personal to the universal, the local to the global, the heavy variation to the vibrating core. You adjust your collar, feel the cool evening air settle into your lungs, and prepare to step into the next chapter of this long, winding story, where Anna's final crusade and the eternal return of the tradition will soon take center stage. You experience Anna's final, vibrating legal battles not in a grand courtroom with polished wood and echoing gavels, but in the stiff, paper-choked corners of modest offices, where the air smells of ink, dust, and the faint, persistent tang of frustration. The year is the late 1930s, and Anna Jarvis, now in her 70s, her eyesight failing, her savings depleted, still moves with that familiar, unwavering rigidity. Her hands trembling slightly as she drafts yet another petition, another letter, another legal brief, asking the very government that established Mother's Day to consider stripping it of its federal status. You probably wouldn't survive a decade of grassroots abolitionist campaigning without at least one dramatic sigh over a misplaced comma, a sudden craving for strong coffee that isn't available after 3 p.m., and a deep appreciation for the invention of the draft folder. Yet here, in the heavy quiet of a Philadelphia apartment that doubles as a war room, Anna's toxic disillusionment clashes with the weighted momentum of a commercial tradition that has already outgrown her. Mainstream historical records confirm that in her final years, Anna Jarvis actively petitioned courts and legislators to revoke Mother's Day's official status, arguing that the holiday had been so thoroughly commodified by florists, card companies, restaurants, and confectioners that it no longer served its original purpose of honoring maternal sacrifice through personal, heartfelt gestures. She filed lawsuits against organizations that used the name Mother's Day for profit, organized boycotts of commercial observances, and even threatened to sue her own sister if she accepted a branded greeting card. You watch as Anna carefully folds a legal document, her fingers moving with deliberate precision despite the tremor, and you feel the vibrating intensity of her conviction, a belief so stiff, so unwavering, that it borders on the tragic. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional labor of fighting a cultural war you're always destined to lose without at least one good cry into a handkerchief, a misplaced bookmark, and a firm belief that stubbornness was invented by someone who really liked to complicate surrender. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in old legal archives and personal correspondence that always makes modern researchers smile. Some accounts suggest Anna kept a blacklist of companies that commercialized Mother's Day, complete with handwritten notes about their offenses, like Hallmark, excessive glitter, FTD, unethical pricing, or local bakery, exploiting maternal sentiment for cupcake sales. Imagine trying to maintain a moral high ground while simultaneously cataloging the exact shade of pink used in a greeting card's floral illustration. It's the 1930s equivalent of running a very passionate, very niche consumer watchdog blog, and you have to admire the meticulous dedication. You notice a small, cloth-bound ledger on Anna's desk, its pages filled with neat, tight handwriting, and you wonder how many late-night hours she spent cross-referencing advertisements with her original vision, trying to quantify the exact moment a gesture of gratitude crossed into transactional routine. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound guardianship comes with a spreadsheet, and that idealism doesn't always retire when the body does. Historians still argue whether Anna Jarvis's final crusade to abolish Mother's Day was primarily a principled stand against the commercialization of intimate human relationships, or if it was significantly influenced by her deteriorating health, financial desperation, and the psychological toll of watching her life's work evolve in ways she couldn't control. You lean back in a stiff wooden chair, listening to the heavy rhythm of her breathing as she pauses to rub her tired eyes, and ponder the question in the quiet dimness of the room. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the tragedy itself. The way a woman who once channeled private grief into a national holiday of personal connection ended up fighting to erase the very tradition she created, not because she regretted honoring mothers, but because she feared the honor had been hollowed out by profit margins. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes how even the most carefully guarded ideals can feel toxic when they're stretched beyond their original shape. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of defending a principle that the world has already repurposed, without at least one dramatic sigh into a paper cup, a strong opinion about branded merchandise, and a firm belief that capitalism has a sense of humour you simply don't appreciate. The afternoon light begins to soften, casting long pale shadows across the cluttered desk and warming the stiff metal of the inkwell just slightly. Anna doesn't speak. She rarely does anymore, except to dictate letters or correct a legal phrase, but her presence carries the heavy resonance of a story that refuses to be neatly wrapped in a bow. You think about the Phrygian drums that vibrated through mountain stone, the Roman petals tossed into parades, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the neutral tea tables where former enemies shared grief, Anna's vibrating typewriter, Wilson's stiff pen stroke, the weighted carnation code, the heavy ritual of handwritten letters, the humid greenhouses where love was cultivated on schedule, the cardboard flood of mass-produced sentiment, the paradox of the childless architect, the stiff corridors of the sanitarium, the weighted irony of anonymous benefactors, the global ripple of varied traditions, and now this, a quiet apartment where the founder of a global holiday petitions to strip it of its status, her toxic disillusionment clashing with the weighted momentum of commercial tradition. The transition isn't jarring. It's gradual, inevitable, like a tide pulling back to reveal the shore it once covered. You probably wouldn't survive the weight of watching history outlive its author, without at least one sudden urge to draft a strongly worded letter, a misplaced bookmark, and a firm belief that time is just a very patient editor. You adjust your posture, feeling the stiff wood of the chair press against your spine, and let the heavy quiet of the apartment settle into your bones. Anna's hands are still now, resting on the legal document, the invisible patterns she once traced giving way to something softer, something that feels less like resistance and more like acceptance. The air carries a faint scent of lavender and old paper, a combination that feels both medicinal and deeply human, a quiet bridge between the clinical and the sacred. You think about how her toxic disillusionment wasn't born of malice, but of a profound, almost unbearable love for a vision she feared was being erased. Yet here in this stiff apartment, in this heavy quiet, you feel the quiet certainty that endings are rarely final. Traditions breathe, they shift, they outgrow their creators, and sometimes the very act of letting go is what allows them to survive. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional complexity of a legacy you can't control without at least one good sigh, a sudden craving for strong tea, and a deep appreciation for the people who keep writing their own letters anyway. As the light begins to soften, casting long, dancing shadows across the room, you take a slow breath and prepare to follow the trail of petitions and legal briefs toward the next chapter of this long, winding story. You think about how Anna's final crusade echoes in modern movements that push back against the commercialization of cultural traditions, of quiet resistance that asks for nothing in return but the satisfaction of staying true to a principle. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional complexity of a legacy you can't control without at least one sudden urge to draft a strongly worded letter, a misplaced house shoe, and a deep appreciation for the people who keep writing their own letters anyway. Yet here, in the stiff, heavy, vibrating moment of abolitionist passion, you feel a sense of continuity, a thread that connects the personal to the universal, the bitter to the sweet, the stiff guardian to the weighted rituals celebrated by millions. You adjust your collar, feel the cool air of the apartment settle into your lungs, and prepare to step into the final chapter where the cradle's echo will soon take center stage, and overpriced mimosas will quietly echo the heavy ancestral grit that once fought for clean water, lasting peace, and the simple, vibrating truth that a mother is the person who has done more for you than anyone in the world. You take one last look at Anna, at the legal document on her desk, at the quiet determination in her posture, and you feel the quiet certainty that this isn't an ending, it's a threshold. You probably wouldn't survive the next phase of cultural evolution without at least one ironic comment about the commercialization of love, a sudden craving for flowers that aren't on sale, and a firm belief that the best traditions are the ones we keep reimagining. Yet for now, in this stiff, heavy, vibrating moment of abolitionist crusade, you let the disillusionment settle into your bones, and you prepare to walk forward, carrying with you the weighted truth that sometimes the most enduring legacies are built not by those who fit the mold, but by those who dare to redefine it, even if the redefinition comes with a side of quiet anonymous checks, global variation, and the eternal return of a simple vibrating truth. You step into the stiff modern branch line, where the air smells faintly of roasted coffee beans, warm pastries, and the subtle citrusy tang of overpriced mimosas that cost more than a week's groceries in 1910. The restaurant hums with a low, polite chatter, forks clinking against porcelain, servers weaving through narrow aisles with practiced grace, and the occasional soft laugh that rises and falls like a gentle tide. You stand near the host stand, feeling the slight distance of waiting in a queue that moves with the deliberate, unhurried rhythm of a weekend tradition. And you notice how the weight of history settles quietly into this space. You probably wouldn't survive a Sunday brunch reservation without at least one awkward table shuffle, a sudden realization that your phone battery is at 4%, and a deep appreciation for the invention of digital waitlist notifications. Yet here, beneath the soft glow of pendant lights, the heavy ancestral grit that once fought for clean water, lasting peace, and basic maternal dignity echoes in every clink of glass and every quiet exchange of gratitude. Mainstream cultural and hospitality studies confirm that the modern Mother's Day brunch emerged in the mid-20th century, as restaurants capitalized on the holiday's gradual shift from domestic, home-cooked meals to commercial dining experiences, fundamentally changing how families gathered to celebrate. You slide into a booth with a worn velvet cushion, watching as a server pours a stream of chilled orange juice into a flute of sparkling wine, the bubbles rising in a quiet, vibrating dance. It's convenient, it's social, it's deeply ingrained in the weekend calendar, and yet beneath the polished surface, you can still feel the heavy resonance of Anna Jarvis's cholera-fighting work clubs, Julia Ward Howe's peace proclamations, Anna Jarvis's vibrating typewriter, and Wilson's stiff pen stroke. The transition isn't a betrayal, it's an adaptation, like a river that changes course but still carries the same water downstream. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional complexity of ordering avocado toast while contemplating the history of public health advocacy without at least one sudden craving for a very simple glass of water, a misplaced napkin, and a firm belief that portion sizes were invented by someone who really liked to complicate lunch. There's a quirky fringe tidbit tucked away in modern hospitality archives that always makes culinary historians smile. Some independent branch spots have quietly revived the tradition of secret mother menus, off-menu dishes or custom toast points named after historical maternal figures like Anna Jarvis, Julia Ward Howe, or even unnamed community caregivers who kept neighborhoods running during crises. Imagine trying to order a cholera prevention Benedict while maintaining a straight face and hoping the chef doesn't ask for feedback on your historical accuracy. It's the 21st century equivalent of embedding Easter eggs in a recipe, and you have to admire the playful homage. You notice a small handwritten card tucked beneath a vase of fresh flowers on a nearby table, its wording slightly smudged but unmistakably personal. Thanks for always keeping the water running and the peace quiet. The gesture is simple, but it carries the heavy weight of a lineage that stretches back to mountain shrines, parish walks, and neutral tea tables. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound honors are also the most everyday, that love doesn't always need a monument to be deeply felt. Historians still argue whether the modern commercialization of Mother's Day has ultimately diluted its original intent of quiet, personal gratitude, or if it has simply provided a scalable framework that allows millions of people to participate in a shared ritual of acknowledgement, even if the execution leans heavily toward convenience. You lean back against the velvet cushion, watching the brunch room breathe in its steady, weekend rhythm, and ponder the question in the warm, coffee-scented air. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as the continuity, the way a tradition can absorb new forms without losing its core pulse, like a song that's covered in different genres but still carries the same melody. You feel that familiar vibration in your chest, the one that recognizes how even the stiffest commercial spaces can soften when genuine connection slips through the cracks. You probably wouldn't survive a lifetime of navigating holiday expectations without at least one good laugh at a mismatched reservation, a sudden appreciation for friends who show up just to share a plate, and a firm belief that love is rarely about perfection anyway. The line moves forward, and you step toward your table, feeling the heavy, quiet echo of everything that came before you. You think about the Phrygian drums that vibrated through mountain stone, the Roman petals tossed into parades, the English posies carried home on stiff legs, the West Virginia work clubs that fought disease with heavy determination, the neutral tea tables where grief softened into hope, Anna's vibrating typewriter, Wilson's stiff pen stroke, the weighted carnation code, the heavy ritual of handwritten letters, the humid greenhouses where love was cultivated on schedule, the cardboard flood of mass-produced sentiment, the paradox of the childless architect, the stiff corridors of the sanitarium, the weighted irony of anonymous benefactors, the global ripple of varied traditions, the toxic disillusionment of a final legal crusade. And now this, a modern brunch room where overpriced mimosas quietly echo the heavy ancestral grit that once fought for clean water, lasting peace, and the simple, vibrating truth. A mother is the person who has done more for you than anyone in the world. The words settle into the air like dust motes in morning light, familiar but never quite worn out. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional weight of tracing a single phrase across 2 millennia without at least one sudden urge to call home, a misplaced coaster, and a deep appreciation for the people who keep answering the phone. A server approaches with a small tray of pastries, placing them gently on the table with a soft, happy Mother's Day, and you nod, feeling the quiet resonance of a tradition that has survived empires, industrialization, commercialization, and the quiet fading of its own architect. You think about how the heavy grit of the past, of boiling water, of neutral houses, of typed letters, of unsigned checks, hasn't disappeared. It's just been folded into the everyday, into shared meal, into quiet acknowledgements, into the gentle pressure of showing up even when it's inconvenient. You probably wouldn't survive the beautiful, messy reality of modern gratitude without at least one slightly awkward toast, a sudden craving for silence, and a firm belief that some traditions are meant to be lived, not perfected. Yet here, in the stiff brunch line, in the heavy hum of weekend conversation, you feel the quiet certainty that the cradle's echo doesn't fade. It just changes shape, adapting to new rooms, new tables, new hands, while carrying the same vibrating core, a quiet, persistent acknowledgement of the people who did more, who stayed longer, who loved without keeping score. As the afternoon light filters through the restaurant windows, casting warm, golden rectangles across the wooden tables, you let the moment settle into your bones. The clatter of silverware, the low murmur of voices, the gentle rise and fall of weekend laughter. It all feels like a quiet testament to a tradition that has outgrown its original blueprint but kept its heartbeat. You take a slow breath, feeling the heavy, vibrating truth wrap around you like a familiar shawl, and you prepare to step into the final wind down, where the pace will soften, the imagery will fade, and the long journey through smoke, ink, flowers, and lore will gently close into the quiet space of rest. Let the evening settle around you like a well-worn quilt, heavy but gentle, familiar but never quite exhausted. The story has traveled far, from ancient mountain shrines to quiet parish lanes, from West Virginia valleys to Philadelphia typing rooms, from global calendars to modern brunch tables. But it always returns to the same soft center. You don't need to hold it all at once. Let the details blur. Let the names fade into the background. Let the heavy grit and the vibrant echoes dissolve into the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. There's no rush to remember every date, every name, every turning point. The truth is simpler than that, quieter, more patient. It lives in the spaces between the grand gestures, in the small everyday moments where care is given without announcement, where love is shown without expectation, where a simple presence speaks louder than any ceremony ever could. So let the light stay low. Let the room grow still. Let your shoulders drop, your hands rest, your mind drift into the comfortable dark. You've walked a long path tonight, through centuries of devotion and doubt, through triumph and quiet surrender. And now it's time to close your eyes. The world will keep turning, the calendars will keep flipping, the mimosas will keep pouring, and somewhere, a mother is still doing more than anyone in the world, without fanfare, without complaint, without needing a single word of thanks. Sleep now. Rest well. The story is safe. You're safe. Breathe in the calm. Let the night hold you gently until morning. End of script. Sweet dreams.